It was in the middle of April, during the first soft breaths of spring, when I made a choice I still regret. The 15th, to be exact. I packed my hiking bag and drove out alone to the Blackthorn Mountains, a rough stretch of wilderness about an hour outside Tucson. I'd planned to go with a friend, but he backed out at the last minute. Instead of unpacking and spending the day bored at home, I grabbed my gear and left anyway. The trail I chose was a narrow 10-mile loop that cut through a steep, quiet valley, a place so tucked away that I've never shared its name, not even now. Some places lose their soul once they're found, and this one had already shown me what happened when you disturb something that wanted to stay hidden. I reached the trailhead late, sometime around 6 in the evening. The sun was already slipping behind the rocky cliffs, casting everything in deep red like a wound across the sky. I had 4 miles left to hike before I could reach the spot I'd planned to set up camp. I told myself I could make it if I moved fast, but I already knew it was a mistake. Light fades quickly in those mountains, and once it's gone, the darkness swallows everything, especially sound, and especially you. As I started walking, the trail became more difficult. It twisted and climbed through thick pine woods, the kind that grow close and tall, hiding the light even before the sun disappears. I had to turn on my headlamp sooner than I expected. Its narrow beam cut through the black, just enough to keep me on the path, but not enough to comfort me. There was no wind, no bird song, only the sound of my boots on dry needles and the creaking of old wood beneath itself. I was far from any road, far from any help, and that silence settled around me like a second skin. Too quiet, too deep, like the forest was listening. Every time I stepped on a twig, my heart jumped. I considered turning back more than once, but I was already too deep in, and pride wouldn't let me retreat. When I couldn't see the trail clearly anymore, I stopped in a small clearing, barely enough room to stretch out. There were the remains of someone else's camp there, long dead. A circle of rocks, some burned logs, and the faintest smell of smoke mixed with something sharper, something rotting, though not fresh. It felt wrong, but I was too tired to keep going. I worked quickly, setting up a tarp shelter, gathering whatever dry branches I could find, and getting a fire going. The flames gave off a weak light, a tiny island in a sea of shadow. I heated up a can of stew, trying to shake the feeling that something in the dark was watching me. The air had a weight to it. Wet earth, yes, but also something sour, something like the smell of an animal left out too long. I sat on the ground and started eating, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting. That's when a small object, a pebble, no bigger than a coin, landed right next to my boot. I didn't hear it fall. I just saw it. My hand froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, and I slowly looked around. I hadn't heard any footsteps, any rustling, nothing. Just that little rock, as if it had fallen from the sky or been tossed from the dark. I turned my headlamp into the woods, but the trees were so thick it was like shining a light into smoke. The fire beside me suddenly felt useless, like something pretending to be safe. I tried to tell myself it was just a nut falling from a tree, or maybe my own foot had kicked it, but I didn't believe it. Not really. I finished eating with the knife in my other hand, my back tight with tension, and when I lay down to sleep, I didn't close my eyes. I stayed there, listening to every small sound the forest made. Then, sometime deep into the night, I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of leaves. Not wind, not a small animal. The kind of step made by something heavy, moving carefully. It stopped, then started again, then faded away. I didn't move, didn't breathe. When I finally worked up the courage to reach for my flashlight, the one I had placed right next to me, I found only dirt. It was gone. I sat up quickly, heart racing, and scanned the campsite. Just beyond the last glow of the dying fire, about 20 feet away, something small blinked faintly from a pile of leaves. My flashlight. It hadn't rolled. It hadn't slipped. It had been moved. I hadn't touched it. With shaking hands, I pulled on my boots, gripping the knife tightly. I had two choices: stay put and hope whatever was out there stayed out there, or start hiking back in the dark, exposed on the trail, a glowing beacon for whatever waited in the trees. I stayed. I built the fire higher, using most of the wood I had left. I kept the flames alive as best I could, eyes never leaving the trees. That's when I heard the footsteps again. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They moved around me, circling just beyond the firelight. They'd stop for a while, then return closer, like whatever it was had grown confident. The forest stank now, not just of damp rot, but of something stronger, something like old sweat and damp fur. The air tasted metallic, and the skin on my neck prickled with the sense of being studied. The hours passed like that, me in the circle of firelight, clutching my knife, and something out there. Walking, stopping, waiting. I never saw it, but it felt close. At one point, I was certain it stood only 10 feet away, just behind a thin screen of pines. My fire was low by then, only coals, and the silence that followed was worse than the steps. It was the kind of silence that meant something was ready to act. The darkness pressed in, and I sat frozen, barely daring to blink. The only thing that saved me was the morning light, pale gray thread slicing through the woods. The sound stopped. The air lifted. The woods, when I finally looked around, were empty again. I packed in silence, my limbs stiff, my breath shallow. The flashlight was still there, untouched. I didn't even pick it up. I walked out without stopping, legs shaking the whole way. The trail seemed longer than before, steeper, like the mountain was trying to hold me. When I finally saw my Jeep, I felt the tension crack, but I didn't breathe easy until the engine started, and I was flying down the road, away from the trees. I stopped for gas in a small town half an hour later, barely holding it together. As I filled the tank, I noticed something scrawled in the dust on the back window of my car. Just two words, drawn by a finger in jagged, looping letters. Sleep tight. That was all. I've never gone back to the Blackthorn Mountains. I haven't hiked alone since. And sometimes, even in my house, I wake up sure I hear footsteps circling outside. Soft, slow, waiting for the fire to die out again. When I was 14, my favorite place in the world was Green Hollow, a thick, private stretch of forest land in northern Virginia where my extended family kept old wooden cabins. It was the kind of place where generations had built memories, and nearly everyone on that land was somehow related by blood or marriage. There were maybe 6 or 7 homes scattered along a long, winding dirt road that forked at the end like a crooked T. Just above the road, no more than 150 feet away, ran Swift Creek, always cold and fast, snaking through the trees like it had been there forever. Most of the time, I stayed in my mom's small cabin to the right of the fork, a one-story shack with peeling paint, the kind of place that smelled like pine and mothballs. I liked being alone out there. It was quiet and wild, the air thick with the smell of moss and old wood. I'd wander through the trees for hours, watch the deer drink, skip rocks at the water's edge. That summer on the 20th of July, everything changed. My cousin Lena was visiting that year, crashing with our grandmother in one of the cabins further up the road. Lena was 28, tall and covered in tattoos. Her hair dyed this shocking red that made her look like she'd stepped out of a movie. She didn't act like the adults I knew. She cursed freely, rolled her eyes at rules, and laughed at everything like the world was a joke. I liked her. So when she asked to come with me into the woods that afternoon, I didn't hesitate. I thought she just wanted to get away from Grandma's sharp tongue and stricter ways. I didn't know how much we were about to see. We walked left, toward the thicker part of the forest, where the trail turned more into a suggestion than a path. The further we went, the fewer signs of people we saw. Lena hung back, lighting a joint. the smoke curling through the branches as I moved ahead. I didn't care. I didn't smoke, but it wasn't my business. I just wanted to sit by the creek and watch the water ripple in the sunlight. I was kneeling by the creek, poking at the dirt with a stick, watching tiny fish flick around the rocks, when a sound cut through the air. A short, crisp click, not a natural one. Not a twig, not a bird, not wind. It was mechanical, intentional. I looked up slowly, heart beginning to thump, and locked eyes with someone standing directly across the creek. He hadn't been there a second ago. The man was maybe in his 50s, though it was hard to tell. He was thin, with a long scruffy beard, sun-leathered skin, and wearing a heavy black coat despite the July heat. His jeans were shredded and thick with dried mud. And in his hands was an old camera, the kind you have to wind with your thumb. Yellow, cracked, held loosely like it was a toy. He stared at me without blinking. Then his mouth stretched into a smile. Not a friendly one. Not the kind that says, "Hello." It was slow and crooked and wide, like he was savoring a private joke. That's when he lifted the camera and aimed it directly at me. I couldn't move. My stomach twisted and my limbs turned cold. The air grew heavy, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. Behind me, Weena stumbled out of the brush, still laughing at something I hadn't heard, until she saw him. Her voice cut off. I turned my head slightly to look at her, hoping she'd say something, anything, but her face was white, her eyes wide. The man never looked at her. His focus stayed on me. He wound the camera again. That click echoed in my bones. Then he did something I'll never forget. He raised his free hand, wagged a finger at me, slow, scolding, mockingly playful, then reached to his belt and tapped something. A sheath. A knife's handle stuck out of it. He didn't unsheath it. He didn't need to. The threat was clear. Then, just to make sure we understood, he dragged his thumb across his own throat, still grinning. My legs finally responded. I grabbed Lena's arm and ran. We didn't speak. We didn't stop. The forest became a blur, roots, leaves, shadows, and I pushed forward with a strength I didn't know I had. My lungs ached. I heard something behind us, faint, like a footstep or another click. Or maybe I just imagined it. I couldn't risk looking back. The creek was narrow there, shallow enough for a grown man to cross in seconds. And I knew he could be right behind us. We veered sharply toward an old, crumbling stone staircase buried deep in the woods. A strange structure we'd discovered years ago that led nowhere, overtaken by vines. Lena yanked me behind it, and we collapsed behind the wall of mossy stone, crouching low, barely breathing. I covered my mouth to muffle the ragged gasps. Somewhere out there, twigs snapped. Heavy footsteps, not running but steady, relentless. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. We stayed there for what felt like hours. My thighs burned from crouching, but I didn't dare move. The sounds eventually faded, but I could feel something still watching. Lena finally whispered that we had to get back. I stood shakily, my leg cramping as I stepped forward, only to trip over a root and slam my knee into a rock. Pain shot up my leg, and warm blood soaked through my jeans. I whimpered, half from fear, half from agony, and she grabbed me, dragging me upright. We hobbled through the trees, breathless, barely able to think. The woods didn't feel like they used to. They felt hostile, alive, and not on our side. When we finally broke through the trees and saw the fork in the dirt road, I almost collapsed with relief. We didn't stop until we burst through the door of my grandma's cabin. I was crying before I hit the floor. My grandmother's eyes hardened when she saw the blood and our terror. She didn't ask questions at first. She called my grandfather, and within minutes, he and 2 other men were grabbing flashlights and rifles, marching into the woods like they already knew what they were looking for. I tried to explain, but the words sounded like nonsense once they left my mouth. The camera, the knife, the smile. Lena nodded along, backing me up, but even then, I could see doubt creeping into their eyes. They searched for hours and found nothing. No boot prints. No man. No camera. No sign of anything. By the time my mom arrived, shaken and furious, the story had already started to rot. She accused me of overreacting, said maybe I'd seen a hunter. Maybe I panicked. Even Lena's voice couldn't sway her. They argued, and I sat in silence, feeling smaller by the second. That night, every door on the ridge was locked tight. The adults didn't say why. They didn't have to. I never saw that man again. But I still remember his face. The way his grin never reached his eyes. How he looked at me like he already owned me. And I wonder sometimes if my picture is out there somewhere, hanging on a wall, stuck in a drawer, part of a sick collection. I haven't wandered alone in the woods since. And when I visit Green Hollow now, I don't go near the creek. I stay close to the cabins, where the windows have locks and the trees feel a little less alive. But I never forget. Not the camera, not the finger, not the way he smiled like he knew something I didn't. It was the 3rd of August, back in the summer of '98, when I agreed to go on a camping trip with my old friend Caleb. We hadn't spent much time together lately life, pulling us in different directions, but he called out of the blue and asked if I wanted to head out into the Whispering Pines, a dense sprawling forest 100 miles west of my home in Richmond. I hadn't been camping since I was a kid, not seriously, and the thought of breathing fresh air, escaping the noise of the city, and reconnecting with someone who knew me from way back stirred something in me. I packed too quickly, barely sleeping the night before. My mind buzzed with excitement, and when Caleb pulled up just after sunrise, I was already waiting on the porch with my pack slung over one shoulder. We drove through winding mountain roads, the morning mist still hanging low over the valleys, giving the trees a ghostly appearance. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you and makes the world feel suspended. I dozed off here and there, lulled by the road and Caleb's soft humming. But just as we turned off the highway onto a gravel forest road, he hit me with something I hadn't expected. The campsite wasn't accessible by car. We'd need to hike at least 2 hours from where we'd park. I tried to talk him out of it, suggesting we just camp somewhere closer, but he waved it off with that confident grin he always had. He promised it would be worth it. Said it was the most beautiful, untouched spot he'd ever seen. I didn't want to look weak, so I nodded and started the hike with him. At first, the path was gentle, soft earth beneath our feet, the air rich with the smell of pine and cedar. The trees were tall and close, their branches weaving a canopy that filtered the sun into broken beams of gold. But soon, the trail turned steep, and every step began to feel like a chore. My thighs burned, my shirt clung to my back. Caleb was in better shape and pulled ahead, tossing occasional words of encouragement over his shoulder, but they felt distant and thin. I was too focused on my feet, on avoiding the roots and loose stones that threatened to send me tumbling. Eventually, the ground leveled out, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But that calm lasted maybe 30 seconds. I stepped forward, expecting solid earth, and instead my foot hit nothing. I dropped fast. A flash of dirt. A sickening twist. Then pain. I landed hard. Air knocked out of my lungs, and the world spun for a second before settling. When I could finally move, I looked around and realized what had happened. I had fallen into a pit. The sides were steep, maybe 10 feet high, slick with wet mud and tangled roots. But worse were the stakes. Old wooden spikes, hidden just below the surface. Most were broken or rotted, but some still stood, sharpened and waiting. My ankle had twisted violently in the fall, and when I tried to stand, it gave out completely, sending a wave of pain shooting up my leg. I shouted for Caleb, my voice echoing strangely off the pit walls. After what felt like ages, his face appeared above, pale and shocked. He called down, asking if I was okay, but my answer must have been garbled by fear. I told him I couldn't climb, couldn't move my foot. He looked around helplessly, then tried lowering a branch, but my hand slipped on the wet bark, and the pain was too much. He muttered something I couldn't hear, pacing at the edge of the pit, before finally saying he'd go for help. The ranger station was back near the road, a full-hour hike, maybe more. I nodded, too scared to be alone but knowing there was no other way. When he disappeared, the silence grew heavier. The forest felt wrong, too still. The birds had stopped, the wind died, and I was left with nothing but the sound of my own breathing. The pain in my ankle was intense, but there was something worse, a sensation why I couldn't shake, like I wasn't alone, like something was watching from just beyond the edge. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling was as strong as hunger. I tried humming to myself, old songs from childhood, but the noise only seemed to make the silence lean in closer. Clouds rolled in. Rain began as a drizzle, then turned heavy, soaking me to the bone. The pit turned to sludge, cold and slick, the water creeping up around my boots. I dragged myself to one side, pressing against the wall, trying to keep the stakes from touching me. My breath came in shallow bursts. I kept imagining something, someone above, just out of sight, leaning over quietly, watching me flail and freeze in the muck. At some point, I swore I heard a snap above, a footstep. But when I looked up, there was nothing, just trees and rain and mud. It could have been my mind, stretched thin by pain and panic, but I knew what I felt. That something had been there, and it was still close. Time bent in the pit. I didn't know how long I'd been down there when I heard voices, real voices. Caleb's and another man's, deeper, calmer. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. They dropped a rope down. I grabbed it with shaking hands, and together, they hauled me out. My ankle screamed the whole way up, but I didn't care. I was out. The ranger's face was unreadable. He looked at the pit like it was an old ghost, something that had been waiting to swallow someone. He told us it looked like a poacher's trap, old, likely abandoned, illegal, and dangerous. But he didn't seem surprised it was there. That unsettled me. They took me to a hospital. No break, just a terrible sprain. I'd need crutches and time. Caleb apologized over and over. He'd never meant for it to go like this. I believed him, but something between us shifted after that. The woods had turned on me, or maybe revealed themselves for what they truly were. We never went back to Whispering Pines, and Caleb stopped suggesting long hikes after that. Sometimes, when it rains, I smell the mud again. I feel the cold of that water, creeping up. I think of those stakes, and I think of the feeling I had while lying helpless in the dark, the certainty that something waited above, quiet and curious, not there to help, just watching. When I was 12 years old, I lived in a decaying apartment on the edge of Millwood, a forgotten Ohio town hemmed in by cracked roads and fading signs. My parents weren't exactly what anyone would call attentive. My mom spent her days sinking deeper into bottles of cheap wine, her eyes always glassy, her words slurred and angry. My dad was a trucker, mostly absent, gone for weeks at a time, then home just long enough to remind us of his presence with loud shouting and a temper that flared easily. I grew up learning that the quieter I was, the safer I felt. So I made myself scarce whenever I could, and that usually meant escaping into the woods behind our building, a sprawling, tangled mess of pine and shadow called Raven's Hollow. That forest became the only place where I could breathe, where the weight of neglect and fear didn't press down on my chest. By the summer of '99, especially around the 10th of June, I had begun spending entire days out there, building crude shelters out of sticks and bark, pretending they were secret forts. I kept moving my camp deeper, further from the world I was born into, deeper into silence and away from the stink of beer and yelling. I wasn't stupid though. I knew I wasn't alone in Raven's Hollow. Even at that age, I understood there were others. People who didn't belong in town, who had no homes, no rules. Sometimes I saw their trash. Broken bottles, cigarette stubs, empty cans. And once, I found a needle. I stayed far away from those areas, keeping to the other side of a narrow creek that cut the woods in half like a scar. That creek became my line, my boundary. I told myself the drifters stayed on their side, and I stayed on mine. It was a fragile comfort, but it helped me sleep. At night, I'd sometimes sneak close to their camps, watching from the darkness, hidden behind fallen logs or thick shrubs. I watched them laugh too loudly, shout at each other, stumble around with wild eyes and dirty clothes. It reminded me of home, the unpredictability, the tension, and it filled me with both disgust and pity. But I never let them see me. I stayed hidden, heart thudding, then crept back to my lean-to shelters, where the sounds of the forest would eventually lull me to sleep. That summer was different. More people seemed to pour into the woods. Their voices carried further. Their fires glowed brighter across the water at night. One humid afternoon, I was crouched by the creek, filling my canteen and swatting at gnats, when I heard something. Harsh voices arguing, not in a playful or annoyed way, but sharp, bitter. I crept forward, crouching low behind a thick log wrapped in ivy. Through a screen of ferns, I saw them. A clearing with a sagging gray tent at its edge. 4 figures stood nearby, 3 men and 1 woman. Their faces were sunburned, angry, their clothing soaked in sweat and dirt. Bottles hung from their fingers like weapons. I couldn't hear every word, but the tone said everything. Something had gone wrong, and no one was backing down. I should have turned away. I knew it. But something pinned me there, some dark magnetism, a pull I couldn't break. One of the men, thin and wiry, wearing a stained red cap, lunged at another. The punch came fast, sudden. The second man collapsed, grabbing his head, groaning. Before I could even process it, the thin one grabbed a rock, jagged and heavy, and slammed it into the man's skull. I flinched, my body seizing with horror. The sound of the impact seemed to echo across the clearing. He hit him again, and again. His arms trembled by the time he stopped. The man on the ground didn't move. His limbs were splayed, and blood pooled around his head, soaking into the soil like oil. The woman screamed something, shrill and wordless, then struck the attacker in the chest with an open hand. They stared at the body, and then, just like that, all 3 of them turned and ran into the woods, vanishing like ghosts. I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain was trying to deny what my eyes had seen. Maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe it had all looked worse than it was. But deep down, I knew better. I knew death when I saw it. The way the man's body lay, too still, too twisted. It didn't belong to the living anymore. The silence that followed was unbearable. The forest around me, once my safe place, now seemed tainted. The trees loomed taller, the shadows darker. I stayed hidden behind that log for what felt like hours. My legs went numb, my breath shallow. I was afraid if I moved, they'd come back. Or worse, someone else would come. When I finally gathered the strength to run, I didn't stop until I reached the apartment. My chest ached. My arms were scratched and bleeding from branches. I burst through the front door, heart hammering. Mom barely glanced up from her stained recliner. Dad was home, beer in hand, already slurring. I tried to tell them. I told them everything. The argument, the man with the rock, the blood. But Dad's face twisted with anger. He said I was lying, that I made the whole thing up. Mom agreed, mumbling about how I just wanted attention, how I was always inventing stories to get out of trouble. I screamed, desperate to make them understand. Dad stood up. I barely saw the belt before I felt it. The pain shut me down. The truth was beaten back into silence. I crawled into my room, curled up on the mattress with no sheet, and cried. The woods, my escape, had shown me a side I couldn't unsee. I didn't go back. And Dad, noticing my sudden fear of the forest, grew suspicious and controlling, watching my every move. Soon after, I was sent away, packed off to live with my grandfather in a small, quiet house 2 towns over. I expected more of the same, more shouting, more silence. But Grandpa Eli wasn't like them. His voice was calm, his eyes kind. He noticed the way I stared at the trees through the windows and never asked why. When I told him I liked the outdoors, he smiled and showed me trails he'd walked with his father. He let me rediscover nature, carefully, slowly, one safe path at a time. It took years before I could talk about that summer. On the 5th of March, when I was 16, I finally told him. I told him everything. The clearing, the rock, the blood. He listened without interruption, then put his arms around me and said I'd done what I could. He encouraged me to speak with the police, to finally let the weight go. I did. The detective listened without judgment. They looked into it. Months later, Grandpa told me they'd found them. Or at least, found what was left. Only one of the 3 was still alive, the woman. She led the authorities to the shallow grave. They said my statement helped close a cold case. But no one from my old life ever mentioned it again. Not Mom, not Dad. They pretended it never happened. Years have passed since then. My father died last year, and with his death, the memories returned sharper than ever. I work now in land preservation, protecting forests from people like the ones who once used them as their hiding place. But I never camp alone. I never cross shallow creeks without checking who's on the other side. And in my quiet moments, I remember that clearing in Raven's Hollow, the blood, the silence, the way the forest changed that day. The woods gave me peace once. Then they taught me how fast that peace can turn to violence. It was late in the fall of '81, right before Thanksgiving on the 20th of November, when my family loaded up our station wagon and headed out to Blackthorn Woods, a massive stretch of forest land a few hours outside our hometown of Asheville. It had become something of a twisted tradition, my dad dragging us out there to camp during hunting season, under the thin excuse of family time, though everyone knew it was just a way for him to sneak off with his old rifle, despite Mom's rule that guns were no longer allowed on family trips. She'd banned them years earlier after an argument that ended with a shattered coffee table and a bullet hole in the shed. But out in the woods, Dad always found a way to bring one along. The trees were tall and sharp-smelling, and I remember being struck by how still the air felt, broken only now and then by the distant cracks of gunfire echoing through the forest. Reminders that we weren't the only ones wandering out there. Back then, that kind of danger wasn't taken seriously. Parents let their kids roam wild, and my younger brother, Tim, and I took full advantage. From the moment we pitched our tents, we were gone, running through the underbrush like feral animals, chasing each other from dawn to dusk. That morning, Tim and I were far out from camp, playing one of our favorite games, Soldiers. We'd gotten the idea from the action movies we weren't supposed to watch, but always did anyway at our friends' houses when the adults weren't paying attention. Tim had just turned 8 a few days earlier, and for his birthday, he'd gotten a set of cheap plastic walkie-talkies. They were finicky, full of static, but we thought they were the coolest things in the world. We wore matching camo jackets that smelled of mothballs and pine, and the deeper we went into the woods, the more we felt like we were on a mission. I was crouched on a mossy stump, pretending to scan the forest for imaginary enemies, when something real happened. A sharp noise cut through the quiet, louder than anything we'd heard all day, and not from the walkie-talkie. It was a crack, fast and violent. I felt a rush of air whip past my ear, and before I even registered what was happening, I was on the ground, face in the dirt, frozen. For a moment, there was nothing. No voice, No follow-up, just silence. But then I heard it, a faint moan coming from somewhere ahead. Tim's walkie was quiet. Too quiet. I called his name into it, again and again, but there was no reply. The sound came again, that low, broken moan, and something inside me knew. I started moving without thinking, pushing through thick brush and thorns that clawed at my sleeves, guided only by the pit in my stomach and the weak sound I was chasing. The woods felt strange, off balance. The light seemed dimmer than it should have been for midday, and the trees looked taller, closer, as if the forest itself was leaning in to watch. I stumbled through the undergrowth, heart hammering, and finally found him. Tim was curled up in a tangled mess of vines and leaves, hidden beneath a dense thicket. His face was gray, his eyes glassy, and his jacket was soaked in blood. A dark stain spread from his side, sluggish but steady. His small hand was pressed against his ribs, fingers twitching slightly as he looked up at me. I knelt beside him, hand shaking, trying to remember what to do, what to say. I told him he'd be okay. I said it again and again, even though I didn't believe it. He was too small, too pale, and I didn't know how deep the wound went. I tried to lift him, but he was heavier than I expected, and my arms gave out quickly. I got maybe a few dozen yards before my legs gave out too, and we both tumbled into the ferns. Tim's voice, barely above a whisper, told me to go get help. I didn't want to leave him there, alone and bleeding, but I knew I had to. I took off running, lungs burning, crashing through the brush without looking back. By the time I reached the camp, I could barely speak. Mom was at the fire pit, stirring something in a dented pot, and one look at my face made her drop the spoon and call for Dad. He came stumbling out of the tent, annoyed at first, until I managed to point toward the trees and gasp out Tim's name. That was all it took. His face went blank, and he was gone, boots pounding the earth as he sprinted into the forest. I tried to follow, but everything blurred. My legs wobbled, my head spun. By the time I caught up, Dad had already found him, cradling his limp body and moving fast. We drove to the hospital in a haze. Mom kept whispering to Tim, telling him to stay awake, and I held my shirt pressed to his side, feeling the blood soak through. It was warm, too warm. The emergency room was bright and sterile and cold. They took Tim from us the second we arrived. I remember sitting on the stiff waiting room chairs, staring at the scuffed tiles, listening to the ticking clock and trying not to cry. Dad didn't say a word. Hours passed. At some point, a doctor came out, his face drawn but calm. He said Tim had made it. The bullet had missed anything fatal, but just barely. They had removed it, stopped the bleeding, and now he was stable. I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. Relief hit hard, followed by guilt. It could have been me. It should have been neither of us. The police came not long after. 2 officers, quiet and patient. They asked what we'd seen, what we were doing, if we'd seen who fired the shot. I told them everything. The game, the jackets, the walkie-talkies, the sudden sound, the blood. They nodded, took notes. Their eyes were kind, but serious. They told us it was likely a hunter, someone who shot through the brush without checking their target. Maybe they mistook Tim's movement for a deer. It had happened before. They checked hunting licenses in the area, ran records, but in the end, no one was charged. Whoever pulled the trigger never came forward. After that, everything changed. We never went back to Blackthorn Woods. Dad traded his canvas tent for an RV and stuck to packed campgrounds after that, places with signs and fences and other families nearby. Tim recovered slowly. His scar faded with time, a thin pink line across his side, but the memory didn't. Not for me. I still tense at the sound of gunfire, even on TV. And when I walk through the woods now, I find myself scanning the trees, waiting for that sudden shift in the air, that quiet before something breaks. I still wonder sometimes about the person who fired the shot, Whether they know what they did, whether they've withered it in their mind. I wonder if they heard Tim's moan and walked away anyway. Some nights, I dream of the moment before I found him. That stillness, the creeping dread. And I wake with his name on my lips and the ghost of that shot still ringing in my ears. 2 summers ago, on the 15th of July, I planned a camping trip with my stepbrothers, Ethan and Lucas. It was my idea, a kind of bonding experience, though we hadn't grown up together. My mom married their dad when I was 17, and while we all technically lived under the same roof for a while, we never quite clicked. They were both from Portland like me, but they lived on screens while I lived in books and quiet. I figured camping might break that weird wall between us. The destination was Cedar Hollow, a dry, rarely trafficked forest about an hour north of the city. I'd been there before, years ago, and remembered it being calm and isolated, the kind of place where the silence got into your bones. We packed light but carelessly. Food, 1 large tent, sleeping bags, and, because we were young and reckless, 4 cases of cheap beer that took up more space than anything else. At dawn, we loaded into my old truck and took the winding back roads, music humming low, the air awkward but not hostile. No one knew that trip would be the last time we'd all be together as brothers. Not really. We got to Cedar Hollow around noon. The ground was so dry it cracked beneath our boots, and the heat clung to everything like a second skin. We found a clearing that looked promising, tucked away from any other campers. Not that there were many, and surrounded by tall, dry pines that towered like ancient watchmen. I started the fire while Lucas and Ethan bumbled with the tent. They watched the tutorial before we left, but it didn't help much once the poles tangled. I had the flames going strong long before they finished, stacking kindling like I'd done since I was a kid. By sunset, I had potatoes roasting in the coals and steak sizzling on the grate, the smoke curling into the sky. We drank like idiots that night, passing cans around the fire, laughing too loud, music blaring from my portable speaker. There was a moment, somewhere in the haze, where I felt like maybe we were finally brothers, not forced together by marriage, but by shared firelight and foolishness. We stumbled to our sleeping bags some time before dawn, the fire low and the sky just beginning to pale with morning. I remember Ethan tripping over his bag and crawling out to relieve himself, mumbling curses under his breath. I laughed, barely conscious, and passed out hard. It was the last time I ever saw him alive. When I woke the next afternoon, the sun was already high, and the tent felt like a sauna. My mouth was dry, my stomach heavy with regret, and I stumbled out looking for water and food. Lucas was already up, shirtless, sitting near the fire pit, sipping a beer like it was breakfast. The fire was completely out, gray ash smothered in dust, not even a hint of warmth. I looked around for Ethan, thinking he might have wandered off to the creek nearby, but something didn't feel right. The air had a sharp smell, not like meat or firewood, but something twisted, something foul. I thought maybe Lucas had burned something by accident, but then I saw it. Ethan's body lay face down at the edge of the fire pit, arms outstretched, his back blackened and blistered, his clothes charred in spots. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. My brain refused to make the connection. Then the smell hit me fully, and my legs gave out. I collapsed near him, gasping, crawling forward on all fours like I could somehow undo what I was seeing. I reached out, turned him gently, and my stomach flipped. His face was ruined, dark, sunken, lips peeled back from scorched gums. His eyes were gone. I shouted for Lucas, and he came running, beer dropping from his hand as he saw Ethan. He screamed, a deep, strangled sound that didn't sound human. He fell beside me, grabbing Ethan's shoulder, shaking him like it would wake him up, but he was gone. Whatever had happened long before we woke up. The next few hours blurred. I remember pacing in circles, trying to use my phone but getting no signal. I remember Lucas dry heaving behind the tent. I finally climbed a small hill and got enough service to call for help. Rangers arrived about an hour later, their trucks rolling in slowly like they already sensed what they were walking into. They covered Ethan with a tarp, asked us questions we could barely answer, and tried to make sense of a situation that made none. They took photos, collected what little evidence they could find. We sat on the bumper of one of their trucks, silent and shaking, unable to look at each other. When the medical examiner's report came back a few weeks later, it said Ethan had severe burns, mostly post-mortem, but also multiple bruises across his back and a skull fracture that might have occurred before the fire touched him. They couldn't be sure whether he'd fallen into the coals, or whether someone had hit him, or if the heat alone had caused his injuries. They left it as accidental, tragic, unexplained, but closed. I told myself the same story over and over. Ethan, drunk and clumsy, stumbled into the fire, passed out, and never woke. But the bruises stayed in my mind. So did the smell, and the position of his body, like he'd fallen while crawling toward us. Lucas changed after that. He got quiet, watchful. He didn't speak much to me, and when he did, his words were clipped, careful. I started catching him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, just staring. I knew they hadn't always gotten along. Ethan was older and could be rough, mocking, especially when he drank, but I never thought it was serious. Still, something in Lucas's silence made my skin crawl. He never said anything outright, never accused or hinted, but I felt it in the way he avoided my gaze, in the way he flinched when I mentioned Ethan's name. I began to wonder what had really happened that night. If maybe there had been a fight, something stupid that escalated. If maybe Ethan had fallen or been pushed, and Lucas just didn't have the words to explain it. I never asked. I was afraid of the answer. Our mom was devastated. Ethan had been her favorite, though she never said it aloud. Losing him broke something in her, and I couldn't add suspicion to her grief. I kept my thoughts quiet, buried deep beneath the version of events we gave the world. We never returned to Cedar Hollow. I haven't set foot in those woods since. I avoid campfires, the smell of smoke turning my stomach even now. Sometimes I dream of Ethan, not how he looked that night, but how he laughed, how he danced clumsily to the music, how he shouted over the fire as he toasted invisible ghosts. But the image always changes. The flames catch, the light shifts, and suddenly he's on the ground again, crawling, reaching, burning. I wake up sweating, heart racing, unsure whether the memory or the dream is worse. I've started asking questions in secret, checking maps of the area, looking for old reports of violence, wondering if there's something darker about Cedar Hollow than we ever realized. Part of me thinks Lucas knows more than he'll ever say. Part of me fears that if I dig too deep, I'll find out exactly what happened that night. And part of me already knows and doesn't want the truth, just the silence. From the age of 16 to 20, between the summers of 2014 and 2018, I worked as a counselor at Camp Silverwood, a secluded overnight camp hidden deep in the woods of upstate Vermont. Every year, it opened in late June and ran until the first week of August. Kids would arrive on Sundays wide-eyed and buzzing with energy, and leave on Fridays sunburned, mosquito-bitten, and sometimes changed. The camp sat on 5 wild acres of forest, clearings, and pond, a kind of closed-off world where the trees grew thick and the past felt close. There were a handful of weathered wooden cabins, a large dining hall with creaky floors, a small art shed, and a few storage buildings scattered between the trees. Winding gravel trails connected everything, and just beyond them the land dropped sharply into a shale-lined ravine. The nearest main road was miles away, and there was no cell reception worth speaking of. Electronics were banned for campers, and only staff had walkie-talkies, which barely worked past the dining hall anyway. That isolation, once comforting, would later come to feel like something else entirely. a kind of boundary that didn't just keep the world out, but kept something else in. I first came to Silverwood as a camper when I was 9. Back then, I loved it. The canoeing, the stargazing, the songs sung too loudly around fires. But returning as a staff member opened my eyes to something I'd never noticed as a child. There were whispers. Stories passed between counselors in low tones, half jokes that didn't quite feel like jokes. Weird lights seen in the sky. Tools that vanished and reappeared in places no one remembered leaving them. Doors that unlocked themselves. Footsteps heard in empty cabins. It all started on my very first week back. The training week when no kids had arrived yet. Just the staff settling in, learning the new schedules and safety drills. One night we were lying on the grass outside the dining hall, stargazing, watching satellites crawl across the dark. Someone pointed out a red light, far above the trees, flickering strangely. Then another. They darted, stopped, moved in ways that defied normal flight. One counselor, an astronomy nerd, insisted they weren't planes or drones or anything he could explain. His voice was tight with something like fear. They vanished just before dawn, leaving a strange stillness behind. That week, I started waking up drenched in sweat from dreams I couldn't explain. Figures standing at the edge of my bunk, faceless, watching me. The dreams came often, and when I opened my eyes, the cabin was always silent. Too silent. Sometimes, I'd find my locker door swinging open when I was sure I had latched it tight. Other times, the lock would jam for no reason. A few of the older counselors just nodded when I told them. "Silverwood does that," one said. "You'll get used to it." But I never did. There was a gravestone on the hill near the girls' cabins. Old, worn down by weather and time, barely legible. But you could tell what it was. A small stone, cracked in one corner, its surface smooth where names had once been carved. No one knew who it belonged to. The senior staff said it had been there longer than any of them, and we were told not to talk about it in front of the kids. It stood alone, a silent watcher just above the pool, and I passed it every day with a strange chill in my spine. That first summer, I'd sometimes leave offerings beside it. Flowers, stones, little tokens, half out of respect, half out of unease. At the end of the season, someone removed it. Just gone. No explanation. A flat patch of disturbed earth left behind. After that, things got worse. The stories shared around the campfire shifted in tone that summer. No more silly ghost tales or harmless pranks. Instead, we spoke of shadows, recurring shapes caught at the edge of vision. A child's laughter when no children were nearby. Windows fogged from inside a locked shed. One counselor said they'd seen a pale figure walking near the meadow at night. A boy's shadow darting under the street lamp. Too fast, too smooth. Another claimed a woman stood on the porch across the road from the camp, dressed all in white, watching the cabins without blinking, never moving until sunrise. At first I laughed. But then Jasper, a quiet but trusted counselor, pulled me aside and led me up a ridge. He pointed at the meadow and showed me the truth. The boy's shadow was just a silhouette cast by a control box near the lamp. The woman was a flag, caught in the wind. But Jasper didn't smile. "Those are just the stories they let you see," he said. "But Silverwood still holds the ones they don't." His eyes lingered on the dark woods behind the ravine. I didn't know what he meant, but his voice left a mark. The worst building in the camp was Pine House. It was a 2-story lodge set apart from the main cabins. An old farmhouse built long before the camp existed, used now only for day campers who left before nightfall. It stood at the end of a narrow path, shaded by gnarled trees and barely touched by sunlight. Inside, the air was stale and oppressive, as if the house had never fully exhaled. I hated going inside. The floors creaked under your weight in slow, agonizing groans, and the lights were always too dim. But my job often brought me there. I would check the rooms before lockup, making sure no kid had left behind a water bottle or forgotten jacket. Every time I turned a corner, I expected something to be standing there. Not a person, but something older, watching. The worst part wasn't the building itself, but the cellar, a pair of slanted doors at the base of the house, padlocked and rusted shut. No one had the key. We were told not to use it, not to even try. But that rule came with no explanation, which only made it worse. One year, during training week in 2016, we ran a missing camper drill. It was standard every year. Staff would play the part of a lost camper, and we'd all split up into zones to practice searching. That year, I got assigned Pine House, alone. It was almost sunset when I made it to the building. The path felt longer than usual. The trees closed in, and the breeze stopped altogether. I unlocked the front door, stepped into the heavy silence, and called for Lila, the counselor pretending to be the missing camper. The rooms were empty. Dust floated in the fading light like ash. Every drawer, every corner held nothing. I checked the closets twice, convinced something was hiding, but found no one. As I left the building and relocked it, I felt cold sweat on the back of my neck. I turned toward the cellar doors, still locked, but something felt wrong. I walked a short loop into the trees and came back maybe 2 minutes later. The cellar doors were wide open. A dim yellow glow pulsed from below. There was no sound, no movement, but the air was thick and cold, and the light was steady, as if waiting. I stood there for too long, frozen. Then my walkie crackled. Lila had been found on the other side of camp. The drill was over. No one was supposed to be here. I backed away slowly, eyes locked on that open space beneath the house. Later, I told Jasper. He didn't laugh. He said the cellar wasn't empty. Not really. Not ever. That night, another counselor swore they saw a different shed door rattling violently, locked from the outside, as if something inside was trying to get out. They opened it. Nothing. But the lock was scratched, and the air inside was heavy with heat. By my final summer in 2017, I was helping run activities, and my group wanted to use Pine House for crafts. I agreed, reluctantly. But Milo, another counselor, stuck close. Milo believed in energy, in spirits, in the way a place could remember pain. He carried stones in his pocket, murmured things under his breath when walking through certain spaces. The kids liked him. And somehow, when he was nearby, the place felt lighter, less oppressive. He said Silverwood was alive and it didn't want to hurt us. It just wanted to be seen, to be respected. I didn't know what I believed. But when I passed the old cellar doors, still rusted shut again, I nodded. Just in case something behind them was listening. I left Silverwood that August. I never returned. Not because I hated it, but because I felt like the place had finally let me go. It had kept me long enough. Now, I think about it often. I hear from other counselors, some of whom still go back. They say things have quieted down. But others say the air still changes near the ravine, that the doors still creak at night. My grandfather once told me he'd camped near those woods as a boy. He remembered seeing strange lights and waking to the sound of someone calling his name in the dark. He never returned. Maybe Silverwood has always been this way, a place where the past and present blur, where something unseen walks just behind the trees, watching, waiting for those who stay too long in the silence. I was 6 years old this summer. I went to day camp at Willow Creek, a sleepy little Oregon town where nothing big ever seemed to happen, and the world still felt small and soft around the edges. The camp was for kids with diabetes, a safe place where the counselors knew how to check our blood sugar and when to give us juice boxes. It ran from the 1st of July until the 10th of August, and every weekday morning. Mom would drive me down the winding road into the valley, drop me off by the lodge, and promise she'd be back by lunch. The camp itself was bright and cheerful on the surface, a big lodge with wood-paneled walls. A grassy field where we played games like Duck Duck Goose and Red Rover, and a shimmering pool that sparkled in the sun, surrounded by a fence with peeling white paint. We painted rocks, caught frogs, fumbled through crafts with sticky fingers, and played tag until our knees were dirty. But even at that age, I remember something darker running beneath the surface. Something I couldn't explain. Something that made my stomach tighten when I passed a certain counselor, the one with the smooth voice and the long-limbed shadow. His name was Derek. He was probably 17 or 18 at the time, a tall boy with messy dark hair that always hung just a little too low over his eyes. He smiled too easily, too often, with a curve of his mouth that didn't match the kindness we were told counselors should have. His words were soft, too soft, like they were only meant for the person nearest him. And even when he laughed, I never heard real joy in it. I was quiet and small, always one of the shy kids who stuck to the edge of the group. I didn't like being noticed, but Derek noticed me anyway, especially when we were at the pool. The pool was supposed to be the best part. Cool water on hot mornings, squeals and splashing and sun-warmed towels. But I started to dread it. Every time I walked past Derek in my swimsuit, I could feel his eyes. They weren't watching the group like he was supposed to. They were watching me, tracking me. Once, as I passed him, he leaned down and whispered that I looked nice, his voice warm in my ear, too close, too smooth. My heart jumped, and I didn't understand why, but it didn't feel right. I hurried away, pretending I hadn't heard him. After that, I tried to keep a distance. I stayed near the lifeguard. I clung to the edges of groups. But Derek always seemed to drift nearby, always hovering just close enough to cast a shadow. Sometimes I'd catch him watching from across the field, his head tilted slightly, a smile curling at the edge of his mouth, like he was imagining something he didn't want to say out loud. He offered once to take me to the shed to help with supplies, and I lied and said I felt sick. Another time, he said we should walk to the pond together to look for turtles. I said no. I always said no, but I never told anyone why. I didn't have the words to describe the way he made me feel. I didn't know how to explain fear without proof, especially not to adults who might laugh it off or make it worse. Then came the day everything tipped. It was the 15th of July. We were at the pool again. The sky was clear and blue, and the heat bounced off the pavement like a warning. I'd skipped breakfast. I wasn't feeling well, and I'd already had a couple of low readings that week. Still, I wanted to stay in the water. I didn't want to sit out, didn't want to miss the only part of the day that made me feel light. But I could feel it coming, the fuzziness in my head, the heaviness in my limbs, the way everything seemed slower, farther away. A counselor called me to come out, said I needed to rest, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to draw attention. I refused, stubborn and dizzy. I remember the water going dark around me. I remember my body not listening. And then, nothing. I woke up later in the camp's small infirmary, my body weak and shaking, the room smelling like disinfectant and sun-warmed wood. The lights were dim, and the blinds buzzed slightly in the breeze. Someone had saved me, pulled me out and given me CPR, they said. A lifeguard. But when I opened my eyes, it was Derek standing there, leaning in the doorway, his eyes brighter than I'd ever seen them. He didn't look concerned. He didn't ask if I was okay. Instead, he smiled, wide and slow, and said something that made my stomach churn, even though I didn't understand every word. Something about how lucky I was, how intimate it must have been to have someone's lips on mine, even if it was just to bring me back. His tone was playful, like he was teasing me, but his eyes were too still, too sharp. I remember going cold all over, wanting to scream for my mom, for anyone else. He stepped closer like he wanted to come in, but before he could, Mom arrived. Her footsteps in the hall, her worried voice calling my name. He backed off instantly, said he was just checking on me, and slipped away. I didn't say anything, not then. I told Mom I wanted to go home, that I didn't like camp anymore. She didn't press me. She let me stay home the rest of the summer, thinking it was just a sugar crash scare or homesickness. But I stayed close to her every day, never letting her out of sight, sleeping with the light on, flinching at every creak in the house. Years later, when I was 19, I finally told her. We were sitting in the kitchen on the 3rd of December, drinking cocoa with the Christmas tree lit behind us. I don't know why I chose that moment. Maybe because the house felt warm and safe. Maybe because the memory wouldn't stay quiet any longer. I told her everything. Derek's looks, his words, the way he made my skin crawl, and the things he said after I nearly drowned. She listened, really listened, her hands tight around her mug, her eyes wide with guilt. She asked why I hadn't told her sooner, and I said I didn't think she would have believed me, that no one would. I still don't know what happened to Derek. I don't know if he still works at camps, if anyone else saw him the way I did, or if any kids weren't as lucky as me. But I know this. I never go near camps anymore. I avoid swimming pools. And whenever I'm in public and feel someone staring too long, I check for a shadow behind me. Because I remember Derek's smile. And I remember how it felt when someone who was supposed to protect me looked at me like prey. I was 8 this summer. Clara invited me to go camping with her family at Pinewood Lake, a sprawling campground about an hour away from our neighborhood in Concord, New Hampshire. Clara and I had grown up together, living just a few houses apart since we were toddlers, and there was a kind of wordless comfort between us, the kind of bond built on shared Halloween costumes, scraped knees, and whispered secrets during sleepovers. So when her parents invited me along, I was thrilled. My house had been tense that year, filled with shouting that lived in the walls even after my parents went quiet. The idea of spending a weekend under the stars, away from the heavy air of home, felt like the best gift I could have been given. We arrived late, sometime around 10 at night, the air cool and still, the kind of summer night that hums with insects and smells like damp earth and pine. Most of the campground was alive with the distant sounds of other families. Laughter, flickering firelight, clinking bottles. But our site was more isolated, nestled behind a ring of thick pines that seemed to muffle the world beyond. Clara and I were giddy, restless with that kind of childish energy that makes you bold and reckless. While her parents set up the fire and rolled out sleeping bags, we decided to sneak off and play a game. One we'd invented the previous summer. We'd hide just off the path and try to spook people walking by, jumping out with loud whispers and silly faces. We crouched in the bush, giggling under our breath, taking turns popping out at random hikers or families heading to the bathroom. Most laughed or just shook their heads, amused by our harmless game. We felt invisible, unstoppable. It was one of those perfect moments where time slows down and you feel safe in the world, like nothing could touch you. And then we picked the wrong person. A man appeared, walking alone, tall and slow, his steps steady like someone who wasn't in any rush. We leapt out from behind the brush, arms raised, grinning, but he didn't startle. He didn't laugh. He just stopped and stared. The expression on his face shifted slowly into something unnatural. His mouth spread wide, too wide, into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't the smile of someone surprised or amused. It was hungry, tight, wrong. His skin looked pale in the low lantern light drifting in from another campsite, his build wiry but tall, probably in his late 40s. His clothes were dirty, a threadbare jacket, ripped jeans, and boots stained with something dark. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap whiskey hung around him like a second coat, and his eyes never blinked. They locked onto ours with something that wasn't curiosity or confusion. It felt like calculation. I froze, laughter dying in my throat. Clara reached for my hand, and hers was cold. The kind of cold that goes right through you, like her body already knew we were in danger. We didn't speak, We didn't breathe. The man stood still, eyes flicking over us like he was deciding something. Then he tilted his head. That smile still stretched across his face, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like the world had narrowed to just the three of us. Finally, Clara tugged me back, whispered something I didn't even register, and we ran. We sprinted through the trees, twigs scratching our legs, shoes slipping on pine needles, too afraid to look back. When we reached our campsite, Clara's parents were still near the fire, laughing at something on the radio, completely unaware of the weight we just escaped. We didn't tell them. We just slipped into the tent, zipped it shut, and crawled into our sleeping bags, our hearts racing, listening to the night outside like it had changed. The next morning felt surreal. The sun was bright, the campground full of cheerful noise. Clara and I didn't talk about the man. We went along with the day. Marshmallows, skipping stones, helping her dad carry water from the pump. It felt almost normal. Until that evening, we were near the hill behind our campsite, chasing each other through the golden light when a voice called out, long and low. At first I thought it was just another camper. Then I saw him, the same man, standing at the top of the hill, silhouetted by the setting sun. His grin was still there, stretched thin across his face like it hadn't moved since last night. He started walking toward us slow and calm, and I felt every hair on my body rise. I grabbed Clara's arm, trying to stay calm, but she was already backing away. He called again, asking where our parents were, his tone syrupy and wrong, like someone trying to mimic kindness without understanding how it worked. Clara said they were back at camp, her voice flat and forced. The man smiled wider. He said we should come with him, that he had bikes we could borrow. Said his kids were just up the hill. That was when we knew. There were no kids. There were no bikes. There was just him and us. He turned and started walking, waving for us to follow. His trailer came into view, rusted, crooked, parked just off the road. No fire, no tent, no toys or shoes outside. Just the trailer, silent and still. He told us to wait outside while he grabbed something. Clara's eyes met mine, and we both knew what we had to do. We ran, not toward the road. That was too open. We darted into the brush, ducking behind a wall of thorns, crawling into a gap between two trees, so tight we had to hold our breath to stay hidden. A minute later, the trailer door opened, and we saw him again. This time, he was holding something, a roll of duct tape, thick and silver, glinting in the last light. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was blank, cold. He scanned the clearing, eyes moving too fast, too sharp. He stepped closer to where we had just been, sniffing the air like he could still sense us nearby. He'd passed within feet of our hiding spot. I could smell him again. Sweat, smoke, something sour and thick like mold. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. We waited until he went back inside, slamming the door behind him. Then we ran again. Back down the hill, faster than we'd ever run. Branches slapping our faces, our feet barely touching the ground. We burst into the tent, shaking and gasping, and zipped it closed, burying ourselves in our sleeping bags. We didn't tell our parents. I don't know why. Maybe we thought they wouldn't believe us. Maybe we just wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. The next morning, we packed up and left. Her parents joked about how tired we looked. We forced smiles and didn't say a word. Years passed before we talked about it again. We were in college when the memory surfaced. A cold day in January, sipping coffee in Clara's apartment. I don't remember what triggered it. One moment we were talking about something else, and the next, that night spilled out between us. The grin, the tape, the silence of the woods. We sat there for a long time after that, not saying much. We'd escaped, but it didn't feel like it. The memory hadn't faded. It had just gone quiet, waiting. Now, I check every trailer I pass on back roads. I never go camping anymore. And I still dream of him sometimes, not chasing us, not yelling, just standing at the top of that hill, smiling, like he's still waiting for us to follow. When I was 16, on the 7th of September, my family finally planned our first real camping trip. Not the kind in the backyard or just outside town, but a real one, deep in the hills of western Maine at a quiet little place called Willow Bend. We'd never done something like that before. It was me, my mom, my little brother Sam, who was 5 at the time, my younger sister Ellie, and our aunt and uncle with their 2 daughters, Lily and Tara, who were about our age. The girls had been camping dozens of times with their parents and knew how to build a fire and pitch a tent, while we still needed the instructions printed on the bag. It felt like a chance to bond, to step away from screens and get lost in pine trees and campfire smoke. We arrived at the campsite just after noon, the air crisp and filled with the clean smell of pine and dirt. We spent the day setting up tents, fumbling with gear we barely understood, laughing too much, and wandering the narrow trail that looped down to a small lake nearby. That evening we grilled hot dogs, toasted marshmallows, and watched the full moon rise above the tree line, casting long shadows over the ground. I remember thinking it was exactly how camping should be, the kind of night you see in brochures. But everything shifted later in the dark when we crawled into our tent. Our family had set up a big canvas one just a little away from the adult site, closer to the looped dirt road that connected the campsites. It was big enough to fit all 4 of us kids, our sleeping bags spread out across the floor in a tangle of blankets and shared flashlights. We were lying there, whispering about nothing in particular. School gossip, scary movies, dumb jokes, when I noticed something. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss. A steady crunching sound outside the tent, slow and deliberate circling. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer, but the rhythm wasn't right. It wasn't random. It was too heavy, too even, human. The others must have noticed it too, because the whispering stopped. Ellie sat up first, her face pale in the dim glow of the battery lantern we'd left on. Then came the scraping, the slow drag of something along the outside of the tent, starting at the back and working its way around. A finger, maybe, or a stick. I felt every muscle in my body tense. Ellie reached out and touched the canvas where she heard the sound and immediately pulled her hand back with a gasp. She said she felt something solid behind it. A leg, warm through the fabric. Too tall to be Sam, and it definitely wasn't Mom. Her breathing, strained and loud from a tracheotomy, would have been unmistakable if she were nearby. Sam was with the adults, anyway. There was no mistaking that. Lily whispered that maybe it was her dad playing a prank, but even as she said it, her voice shook. The steps continued. They never sped up or stopped. Just that same slow, heavy movement around and around the tent. Like whoever it was waiting for something. I crawled to the side of the tent where the mesh window faced the road. Carefully, I peeled the flap back just enough to look. Down the road, lit faintly by moonlight and a flashlight beam, I saw 2 figures walking toward the site. Our aunt and uncle, returning from the campground restroom. Their voices were low, and their pace was casual. I felt cold dread settle into my chest. It wasn't them. Whoever was out there, circling our tent, was a stranger. Someone we didn't know. And they were close. Too close. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed felt worse. I strained to hear, but there was nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. The night was still again, but not in a natural way. It felt like something was holding its breath, like the air itself was waiting. I wanted to scream for help, to unzip the tent and run, but fear kept me frozen. My mouth was dry, my limbs heavy. The girls huddled together, their wide eyes shining in the low light. I couldn't tell if it was fear or hope in their eyes as they looked to me. Just as I began to shift toward the flap to call out, the voices of our aunt and uncle grew louder. Their flashlight beams swung into view as they rounded the trail and stepped into our part of the site. They were laughing about something, probably still high on the warm night air and freedom from their kids. As they reached our tent, the tension broke. The weight lifted. I flung the zipper open and called out to them, my voice cracking. I told them what had happened, the steps, the dragging sound, the shape Ellie had touched. They looked around immediately, swinging their lights in wide arcs. They checked the perimeter, walked to the edge of the trees, but there was nothing. No footprints, no movement, no trace that anyone had been there. The forest looked the same as it always had, peaceful, undisturbed. They tried to calm us down, said it was probably just a raccoon or a deer brushing against the fabric. They even laughed a little, teasing us for getting worked up over nothing. But I saw the way my uncle's eyes kept flicking back to the trees. How his grip on the flashlight tightened when he thought we weren't looking. He knew something had been off, even if he didn't want to admit it in front of us. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but something had shifted. We still hiked and swam and toasted marshmallows, but there was a quietness between us now, especially at night. None of us ever went anywhere alone again, and every time the wind rustled the tent, we all stiffened. When we told Mom after we got home, she laughed and said we were just caught up in the thrill of telling ghost stories. Said we'd been reading too many of those creepy books we loved so much. My aunt and uncle nodded along with her, smiling like it had all been harmless fun. But I saw the flicker of doubt on their faces, the memory still lingering just beneath the surface. I wanted to argue, to make them understand it hadn't been a story. But no one wants to believe something bad almost happened to kids in a tent. It's easier to laugh it off. Easier to pretend the world is safer than it is. We never learned who it was. Never found out what they wanted. Maybe it was just a drifter. Maybe it was a hunter in the wrong place. Maybe it was worse. But I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if our aunt and uncle hadn't come back when they did. If we'd been truly alone out there, just 4 kids behind a sheet of fabric, no lock, no protection. Sometimes I still hear it. That slow circling, like someone pacing just outside my room. And when I do, I don't move. I lie still, listening, because I know that silence, and I know what comes just before it breaks. It was during the summer of the year 2011 when I finally decided I needed a real break from everything. The noise, the rush, the crowds pressing in on every corner of my city life in Asheville. I couldn't take it anymore. The endless routine had worn me thin, and I needed fresh air. Trees that weren't planted in squares, and silence that didn't come from noise-canceling headphones. That's how I ended up planning a short camping trip to Blackwood Forest, a relatively small but tightly packed woodland area only a train ride away from town. It had a reputation for being peaceful and untouched, not touristy or overly managed like the national parks. I imagined something honest, just me, the trees, and the smell of dirt and firewood. I invited a few friends at first, hoping to make a weekend out of it, maybe share beers around a fire and swap stories under the stars. But one by one, they all bailed family emergencies, excuses about money, or just flaking out like people do. In the end, only Liam, my closest friend, said he was still in. We'd been on a few trips together before, so I figured it would be fine. Maybe even better with just the 2 of us. Less hassle. We boarded a morning train out of Asheville. The air already warm, even though it wasn't yet noon. The sky was a clear and brilliant blue, not a single cloud. When we arrived at the edge of Blackwood, everything felt calm, the only sound being the hum of insects and the occasional bird song. We hiked for about an hour into the forest until we found a clearing beside a narrow, winding creek. It seemed ideal at first glance, a water source nearby, decent shade from the pine canopy overhead, and just enough space to pitch our tents without stepping on each other's toes. But there was something about it, even then, that made me feel weird. Like the trees around us weren't sheltering us, but watching. Like we were too visible, too easy to find. I ignored it. The excitement of finally being in the woods dulled those thoughts. We set up camp, dropped our bags, and relaxed. The physical labor of hiking caught up with us fast, and by late afternoon we were both beat. We built a small fire and cooked sausages, the crackle of the flames and the scent of meat offering a strange comfort. But as we sat there, eating and sipping cheap beer, I had the strangest feeling that the smoke was more than just the smell of dinner. It felt like a signal, like a flare telling anyone nearby exactly where we were. I tried to brush it off, but my body stayed tense. As if summoned by the firelight, a group of strangers wandered into our clearing as twilight began to fall. I didn't hear them coming. One moment, it was just the two of us, and the next, 5 figures emerged from between the trees, their boots making only the faintest crunch on the forest floor. They said they were locals, just passing through, and they smiled like it was nothing unusual. But their eyes that there was something off. They didn't just look at us, they studied us. Their eyes moved too much and stayed too long, like they were taking inventory of our gear, our bodies, the layout of the camp. They asked questions in friendly tones, but the content was too personal. Where exactly were we from? How many nights were we staying? Did anyone know we were out here? Liam was unusually silent, jaw clenched, and I just tried to smile, answering in half-truths while my gut twisted tighter with each second. When they finally left, melting back into the forest without a sound, I realized how hard I'd been gripping my drink, my hand cramped and damp. We stared at the fire for a long while after they were gone. I could feel the pressure in the air shift. Something had changed. It was as if the forest had taken a deep breath when they appeared and hadn't exhaled yet. Liam turned to me and whispered that we should move. I didn't even argue. We packed up fast, the kind of speed you only find when you're running on adrenaline. Our beer haze had dulled, and now we were alert, paranoid. We snuffed the fire out carefully, not wanting to leave smoke trailing into the sky, and headed deeper into the woods, following the faint trail up a wooded ridge. It wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes hike, but it was enough to make us feel hidden. The new spot had some cover, and from certain angles you could see the clearing below where we'd been. We hoped the new spot would keep us out of view. As night came, we rebuilt a smaller fire, just enough to cook our instant noodles. The warmth helped, but we kept it low. The woods around us were alive with quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, it was alert, watchful. We sat there for a while, drinking a little more and pretending to joke around, but there was no energy in it. By midnight, we both turned in, too tired to fight the chill, too nervous to let the fire burn longer. I climbed into my sleeping bag, the cold earth pressing against my back through the tent's thin bottom. I fell asleep hard, but not for long. Something woke me, a pounding in my head and a pressure in the air that I couldn't explain. The tent was completely dark, but it wasn't just darkness. It was the kind that feels like it has weight. Like something is in there with you, just beyond reach. And then I heard it. A low rumbling sound, far off but steady, like an engine. At first I thought I was dreaming, or that it was in my head. But no, it was real, and it was getting closer. The sound wasn't just a car. There were other sounds now, voices, low and sharp, cutting through the trees in clipped phrases. My body seized up. I grabbed my flashlight and boots, my hands fumbling with the zipper. I slipped out quietly and crept toward the edge of the ridge, crouching behind a crooked tree. What I saw below drained every drop of warmth from me. There were beams of light sweeping through our old campsite. Flashlights. The truck's engine was idling, parked just beyond the trees on the narrow path we'd used to get in. Its headlights lit the clearing like a stage, and there were men, at least 4 of them, moving around, checking everything. They weren't just curious. They were angry. I couldn't see faces clearly, but I saw what they held. A bat. A hammer. Something long and coiled, maybe rope. They were cursing, their voices sharp with frustration. They'd expected to find someone there. They wanted us. I didn't wait to see more. I scrambled back and woke Liam, barely whispering what I'd seen. He didn't argue, just sat up instantly, his face white in the darkness. We smothered the fire and grabbed the binoculars from our pack, the ones we brought for stargazing. And then we crouched again, watching, hidden by shadows, not even breathing fully. The men below were tearing through the campsite like animals, kicking the rocks around the fire pit, tearing up the flattened grass where our tents had been, swinging metal at nothing. The rage was wild, not just frustration, but something feral. I felt sick. If we hadn't moved, if we'd stayed down there, there's no doubt in my mind we would have been attacked, maybe worse. My little pocket knife felt like a joke against men with weapons and hate in their eyes. We didn't move. We couldn't. They didn't come up the ridge, thank God, but the truck stayed where it was, its engine still running like a sleeping beast. We just waited, frozen in place, watching every move. Hours passed. The cold sank into our bones, but we stayed crouched in the dirt. I couldn't stop imagining them turning their flashlights upward, climbing the slope, boots thudding over roots and leaves, eyes locking onto ours. Our gear was too bulky to make a run for it, and the trail was too narrow and unfamiliar in the dark. We had no chance if they chased us. Eventually, near dawn, the men gave up and climbed back into the truck. The headlights flared, the engine revved louder, and they drove off down the path, the growl fading into the forest until it vanished completely. Even then, we didn't move. We waited another hour, the silence heavier than before, and only when the sky began to lighten did we begin packing. There was no fire that morning, just fast, silent movements, every twig snap making me flinch. We strapped on our packs and headed back toward the train station with no food, no breakfast, no real rest. Our legs ached, our shoulders screamed, but we didn't stop. By the time we boarded the train, the sun had fully risen. I stared out the window as the trees blurred past. Part of me was angry that the trip had ended early, but most of me was just scared. I kept thinking about the men, about how they moved, what they carried, and what they planned to do. What if we hadn't listened to that gut feeling? What if Liam hadn't said anything? I don't know who they were, criminals, psychopaths, or maybe just people twisted by something deeper in those woods. But I knew one thing for certain. Blackwood wasn't just trees and creeks. It was a place where something bad could happen, and no one would hear you scream. I haven't gone camping since, not in forest like that. Not where shadows move and people come back at night, searching for something to hurt. The city may be loud and crowded, but at least when you hear footsteps outside your door, you usually know they're just a neighbor and not someone dragging a bat through the dark, looking for a fire that used to be yours. A few years ago, I hit a wall with city life. Everything about it, the constant traffic, the recycled air, the blur of screens and sirens had started to gnaw at me. I wanted something that felt more raw, something that would strip away the numbness that had settled into my bones. So I pitched an idea to my friends Nate and Clara. Wild camping, real wild camping in the hills of Dunmere, a rugged patch of countryside tucked into northern England. No tents, no fancy gear, just tarps and sleeping bags under open skies. We'd sleep on the bare ground and eat what we carried. The point was to feel uncomfortable, to get dirty and cold and tired, to remind ourselves we were alive. Surprisingly, they both agreed, and we packed for a week of rough living. Our trip began with a sleepless overnight bus from Manchester, arriving before dawn in a village that felt too quiet, too still, like it had forgotten we were coming. It was late summer, and a wet mist clung to the narrow lanes like it had been there forever. We stepped off the bus half asleep, our packs heavy as bricks, and set out on foot. We barely made it 10 minutes before we got lost. Still groggy, we missed the right fork at a bend and wandered off the path almost immediately. I was embarrassed, even angry at myself. How could we screw up so fast? But it was early, and the streets were empty except for a lone cyclist who drifted past in the mist like a ghost. I flagged him down, asked for directions, and he pointed us back toward a stone bridge we'd somehow missed. His voice was polite, his expression calm, but I saw something behind his eyes, a flicker of concern, hesitation, like he knew what lay ahead and didn't want to say it out loud. I chalked it up to the way locals look at outsiders, curious, maybe a little wary. We thanked him and turned toward the bridge, our boots tapping lightly on damp pavement. The fog thickened, curling around fences and trees, turning everything soft and strange. We passed a weathered war memorial at a crossroads, its stone surface pitted and dark, and something about it made me pause. Crossroads always felt wrong to me, ever since I'd heard old tales about spirits buried under them, bound to wander. I brushed the thought aside and kept walking, but it stayed with me like a whisper in my ear. The path narrowed as we moved south and west, the landscape shifting from village to rough farmland. Rabbits darted across our trail now and then, and once I nearly stepped on one that shot out of the underbrush like a bullet. We laughed, nervously. The terrain grew uneven, the trail forcing us to walk along the road at times, skirting puddles and muddy ditches. A gaudy wooden sign appeared on a fence ahead, shaped like a sword, and painted with symbols I didn't understand, some old dialect, maybe, or a joke that didn't land. The farmhouse behind it was clean and modern, but something about the land felt wrong, like the earth itself didn't want us there. The mud had a sour tang to it, and the air felt heavier than it should. Still, we pressed on, following a track that led past a school and then onto farmland. Wide fields opened up before us, dotted with sheep and cattle. At first, it was beautiful hills rolling away in every direction, the sky starting to clear, revealing the sun in a pale blue canvas. But even then, I felt like we were being watched. We passed a few rundown sheds, their walls sagging, their windows dark. I saw movement in one of them, a flicker, a shadow, and told myself it was just a bird or a bat. The livestock scattered as we approached, which wasn't unusual, but they didn't just walk away, they bolted, as if we'd scared them more than we should have. When we came across a massive waste tank, the smell was awful, sour, and chemical, like decay mixed with metal. We skirted around it, slipping over a gate and into the next field. That's where we hit our first serious obstacle, an electric fence, low enough to trip on but too high to step over with our bulky packs. There were no gates nearby. I found a thick piece of deadwood near a clump of fresh cow dung, and dragged it across the fence to weigh it down just enough for us to step over safely. The hum of electricity still reached my bones. I crossed carefully, sweat prickling at my neck. Nate and Clara followed close behind, neither of them speaking. Their faces looked tight, drawn. We made it through 2 more fields like that, climbing fences that left splinters in our hands and smudges of something on our clothes. The hills ahead looked taller than I remembered, and each step was harder than the last. I pulled out my phone and filmed part of the climb, trying to catch the view, but the lens fogged almost immediately. We reached a ridge we'd camped at before, years ago, and collapsed. My legs screamed, my shirt clung to me, and Clara was steaming in the cool air like she'd just stepped out of a sauna. We ate oatcakes and spread cheese on them, chewing slowly, our breath rising in the morning chill. Nate lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the smoke curling away into the fog. It was still only around 7 in the morning, but we felt like we'd been marching for days. The silence around us was strange thicker now, like the forest was holding its breath. We started moving again, slowly, following a ridge path marked on the map toward a few scattered buildings. We reached them by mid-morning, just a cluster of sheds and cottages. their roofs sagging. That's when we saw the field of cows. It stretched wide before us, the trail running straight through it. On the other side was another electric fence, this one taller, tauter, and covered in barbs. We had a choice: cut across the field and risk spooking the herd, or walk around and climb another fence that looked ready to slice our hands open. We were tired, and the cows looked harmless lazy, chewing slowly, tails flicking. So we cut through the field. At first, nothing happened. The cows stood scattered, uninterested. We walked in a line, not speaking, our boots squishing in the soft soil. But halfway through, I felt it, that tight sensation at the base of my spine, the unmistakable sense of being watched. I looked up and saw that every cow had turned to face us. All of them. Dozens of heads, eyes locked on us. They didn't look curious. They looked angry. I slowed down, my heart beginning to pound. Nate noticed it too, and so did Clara. The cows began to move, not randomly, not like they were spooked, but as one, a wall of slow-moving muscle pushing toward us, their hooves squelching in the earth. The sound of them breathing, snorting, shifting, it was terrifying. They picked up speed, moving from a walk to a heavy trot, then a gallop. Dust rose, hooves thundered, and the air was filled with the pounding of their approach. I froze. My pack dragged at my shoulders, anchoring me to the ground. Nate stumbled back. Clara went rigid. I looked around, desperate for shelter, and spotted a small enclosure not far off, fenced in and maybe safe. But it was electrified, the wires glowing faintly in the fog. The thought of dying slowly by electrocution warred with the image of being trampled. Neither was good. I started to move, but then Clara shouted clear, firm, loud enough to cut through the roar. She told us to stop, to stand tall. I didn't question her. I raised my arms high, made myself as big as I could, heart pounding. Nate followed. The cows slowed. Some of them stopped. Others looked confused, turning their heads as if unsure what we were. The ground still shook under their weight, but they no longer charged. And then we heard it, a human voice, shouting across the field. A farmer stood near a wooden gate, waving his arms, calling out. We didn't wait. We moved slowly, arms still up, stepping sideways toward the gate. The herd closed in, rushing past us, massive and solid, but they didn't attack. They surrounded us like a wall, moving in strange rhythm, herding us toward the gate. I was shaking, sweat pouring down my back despite the chill. My eyes were locked forward. I didn't look at them. I didn't want to. We reached the gate and climbed over, hands slipping on the damp wood. The farmer stood there, weathered and stern, eyes sharp. He told us the cows were just curious, that they often react to unfamiliar people by crowding in. But halfway through his explanation, his voice drifted off. His eyes narrowed as he looked past us, into the woods behind the field. He didn't finish what he was saying. He just pointed down the road toward a house and said we'd be safer there. We followed his directions, not speaking. The mist grew thicker behind us, swallowing the field whole. I felt like something had shifted in that moment, like we'd narrowly avoided something far worse than a cattle stampede. When we reached the house, we collapsed on the porch, too tired to care about our muddy clothes or wet socks. We ate in silence, chewing without tasting. I couldn't stop thinking about the way those cows had moved, the unity, the timing, the way their eyes locked onto us like they'd known we were coming. It didn't feel natural. It didn't feel right. Later, back in Manchester, I did some digging. I found out that cows kill more people than sharks dozens each year, most of it unreported. Farmers warn against crossing fields during calving season, especially with mothers nearby. But this wasn't that. We weren't near calves, and they didn't seem afraid. They seemed like they wanted to hurt us, like we didn't belong there, and they knew it. I don't laugh when I tell this story, even though others do. Attacked by cows, Sounds ridiculous until you feel the earth move under your feet, until you see dozens of heavy animals moving towards you with purpose in their eyes. I haven't gone back to Dunmere. The hills are beautiful, but they feel like they're waiting. I'll take the chaos of the city any day over that silent, watchful countryside. At least in the city, you can hear trouble coming. In the summer of 2019, I hit a wall burned out from my job in Portland, Maine, drowning in bills and lost in a fog of routine. Every day felt like the last. I worked in an office pushing paperwork, inching my way through a life that didn't feel like mine. My friends Ethan and Sam were no better off. Ethan spent his days locked in a call center with a headset glued to his ears. And Sam worked shifts hauling boxes in a warehouse, his back constantly sore. We were all stuck, exhausted, and craving something real. So when the idea came up to go camping, really camping, away from everything, we jumped at it. We didn't have the money or time for anything fancy, so we picked a place close enough to drive to, but wild enough to make us feel like we'd truly gotten away. Pine Hollow, a massive stretch of forest in southern New Hampshire, fit the bill. Nearly 200,000 acres of unbroken wilderness, most of it unused in summer since the hunting season hadn't begun. That meant quiet trails, thick trees, and hopefully no one else around. We loaded up my rattling old sedan on a Friday, our backpacks stuffed with essentials, tents, mess kits, layers, and just enough beer to feel free. As we left Portland, the city fell away behind us in a blur of concrete and noise, and I felt a weight begin to lift. The drive was long. 6 hours with stops for gas and greasy diner food. I remember the waitress at one of those diners, a small, sun-faded place on the edge of a forgotten town, who paused when we said we were heading to Pine Hollow. She didn't say much, but her expression shifted just slightly, like we'd mentioned something better left alone. I noticed it, but I let it pass. I didn't want to let superstition or weird looks ruin what was supposed to be a break from all that. When we finally reached the trailhead, the sun was sinking, bathing the trees in golden light. The woods were dense, the air still and sweet with pine. We hiked a mile in, packs heavy, but our spirits high, until we found a clearing by a small creek. It felt perfect flat ground for tents, flowing water for cleaning and cooking, and thick trees all around. The sky above us was deepening to twilight as we pitched our tents and gathered sticks for a fire. That night we drank, laughed, and told stories until our voices slurred and the flames died down to coals. The forest felt alive but peaceful, its quiet like a blanket wrapped around us. I slept harder than I had in months, the dirt cold under my back, the scent of smoke lingering in the air. The next morning was bright and crisp. We hiked a winding trail that looped past moss-covered stones and arched over a rocky stream, the sound of water rushing below us like applause. The sun filtered through the canopy in streaks of gold, and we splashed our faces in the creek, giddy like kids on summer break. That evening, back at camp, we cooked hot dogs over the fire and laughed until our sides ached. But by the second afternoon, we'd hit a snag. We were out of beer and nearly out of tobacco, which felt like a disaster at the time. Sam was the first to suggest a supply run. The nearest store, according to his map, was a place called Mason's Outpost, right at the edge of the forest, a 3-hour hike each way. It sounded miserable, but we didn't want to go the whole weekend without something to take the edge off. So we left after lunch, the sun still high and the forest warm. The hike was longer than expected, and the trail wound through terrain that was a little rougher than we remembered. When we finally reached the outpost, it was less a store and more a wooden shack crammed with shelves of dusty goods. The walls were lined with hunting gear and taxidermy glassy-eyed deer, a fox, even a snarling black bear mounted above the counter. The man behind the counter, Carl, was grizzled and quiet but not unfriendly. He gave us samples of a dark local stout that burned on the way down and sold us jerky he claimed was made from moose. though I wasn't sure if he was joking. We left with our packs heavy again. Beer, dried meat, some bottles of thick red wine Carl insisted would keep us warm. The hike back was slower. The weight of the supplies dragged at our shoulders, and the sun had started to slip beneath the trees. The trail turned gray, then shadowed, and the forest shifted. It wasn't a sudden change, but subtle, less birdsong, more rustling where there shouldn't be rustling. We passed through a narrow stretch where the trees seemed to lean closer, their trunks crowding the trail. I was buzzed from the stout and sweating under my pack when I felt the urge to pee. I told the guys I'd catch up and wandered off the path into a patch of ferns that blanketed the forest floor. The air was colder there, the light dimmer, and I moved a bit deeper, found a tree, and took care of business. Just as I was zipping up, I heard voices, low, murmuring voices, too far away to make out clearly, but definitely human. I turned toward the sound, brushing ferns aside, thinking maybe some other hikers had stopped nearby. But as I stepped forward, the trees parted, and I saw a clearing. And I froze. 4 men stood in the center. They looked filthy, their clothes ragged, their faces smeared with dirt. One of them held a machete. Another gripped a long knife. A third had something spiked and rusted in his hands that looked like it belonged in a medieval dungeon. But it wasn't just them. On the ground between them was a woman. She was bound wrists and ankles tied tight with rough rope, a gag stuffed in her mouth. Her face was bruised, eyes wild with panic, and her body twitched with fear. Blood stained her torn clothes, and I could see old cuts layered over fresh ones. My breath left my body in one sharp exhale, and I couldn't move. One of the men noticed me. He didn't shout or chase me. He just smiled, raising a finger to his lips in a slow, deliberate motion. That smile, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. I stepped back slowly, carefully, forcing my legs to obey even as my whole body screamed to run. The branches closed around me again, and once I was out of sight, I turned and stumbled back toward the trail. I must have looked insane when I reached Ethan and Sam. I didn't speak at first. I didn't need to. One look at my face and they knew something was wrong. We ran. We didn't debate, didn't stop to pack. We ran like animals, crashing through the woods, our hearts hammering. Ethan vomited at one point beer and jerky splashing the leaves, but he kept going. When we finally stopped, our lungs burning and our clothes soaked with sweat, I told them what I saw. Every word felt like ash in my mouth. Ethan wanted to call the cops right away. Sam hesitated. He was panicking about the alcohol, the drive, the idea that we might be arrested ourselves if the police found our gear or questioned our story. He was wrong, and we knew it, but we understood the fear. We compromised to call the cops, then leave. Get help on the way, but don't wait around to see what else might come out of those woods. We found signal near the trailhead. Sam made the call, his voice shaking as he gave the details, everything I'd seen, where we'd been. The operator sounded calm, too calm, like this wasn't the first horror she'd heard that week. We didn't wait for instructions. We piled into the car, the wheels spinning in dirt as we tore away from Pine Hollow. An hour later, we pulled into a roadside motel, a flickering neon sign our only welcome. The clerk didn't look at us twice. I lay in bed that night and stared at the peeling wallpaper. The shape of the woman's face burned into my mind. I imagined the machete, the blood, the silence of that clearing. And I knew she wasn't going to be saved. She was already gone. In the weeks that followed, I scoured the news. I searched online for any mention of a body, a rescue, even a report of something strange in Pine Hollow. But there was nothing. No articles, no police statements. Just silence, as if it had never happened. Sam and Ethan didn't want to talk about it. We stopped mentioning the trip altogether, like it might somehow reach the wrong ears. Pine Hollow faded from our conversations, but never from my thoughts. The forest had swallowed that clearing whole, along with the people in it, and the woman whose name I would never know. And now, sometimes, I wonder if we were meant to see it. If that man's smile was an invitation or a warning. I haven't gone back to the woods since, not even close. The city might be messy and loud, but at least its horrors wear familiar faces. Out there, in places like Pine Hollow, the monsters don't hide. They wait. It was the spring of 2014 when the idea first took hold, a reckless, maybe foolish idea, born from that familiar urge to do something big, something meaningful. I was restless, tired of the same surface-level charity events my friends and I kept suggesting. We tossed around all the usual stuff, head shaves, marathons, bake sales. But none of it felt like enough, like it could really shake people into paying attention. I wanted something bold, something uncomfortable. So I blurted it out one night. Why don't we hike deep into the Gray Peaks, 20 miles in, and sleep rough in the wild for a full week to raise money for the homeless? I expected them to laugh or roll their eyes. But they didn't. Tom and Laura actually said yes. And just like that, we were in. The campaign came together fast. We called it Homeless for the Homeless, and surprisingly, the name stuck. It worked. We raised over 1,000 pounds, maybe a bit more, and the momentum carried us forward even as nerves settled in. Because the Gray Peaks weren't some gentle countryside. They were serious, jagged, exposed, the kind of terrain where elite forces trained and careless people vanished. We chose early April, hoping to avoid snowstorms and heat waves. But forecasts warned of heavy rain and sharp winds. I dumped too much money into Gear Army surplus jackets, tarps, extra layers. Anything that might keep us dry, keep us alive. We started the hike on a dull gray morning. Our packs were crammed with beans, matches, a tiny gas stove, and more water than we thought we'd need. The first few miles were manageable. Just the three of us trudging uphill, the damp earth soft underfoot, the trees thinning as we climbed. But by mile 17, Tom and Laura were flagging. Laura's face had gone pale, and Tom looked like he was dragging a dead body instead of a pack. We paused near a glassy lake that sat between two ridges, its surface unmoving, like it had been carved from steel. That's when I noticed Tom's bag looked heavier than it should have. When we finally stopped and pulled it open, the reason was obvious. He brought a rifle. Not a real one, not lethal in the traditional sense, just a .22 caliber pellet gun. But even so, it gleamed coldly when we pulled it free. I was furious at first. The extra weight had clearly been grinding him down, slowing him the whole way. If he hadn't brought it, we might have made better time. But the anger passed. He brought it with good intentions, maybe for target shooting, maybe for the odd rabbit. The idea of hunting something, even small, felt primal and grounding. I couldn't blame him for wanting some control in a place that made us feel like ants under God's boot. That first night, we didn't talk much. We were too tired to do more than grunt and open a can of beans over a weak fire. The sky stretched black above us, stars half hidden by clouds. The wind whistled low through the trees, but we stayed close to the lake, our makeshift camp nestled between a ring of rocks and twisted roots. In the morning, we woke stiff and sore, convinced that a morning hunt might lift our spirits. We weren't expecting much, maybe a squirrel, maybe just the comfort of walking with a weapon in hand. Tom handed me the rifle. It felt strange slung over my shoulder, unfamiliar weight pulling at my spine. We moved slowly through the trees, boots wet with dew, the forest alive with quiet. We didn't see a thing. No birds, no rabbits, nothing. It was like the forest had emptied out before we arrived. The further we went, the less normal it felt. I was about to suggest heading back when we broke through the edge of a clearing and stopped short. There was a man standing there. Not a hiker, not a ranger, just a man, wearing an old coat and holding a leash. A dog sniffed the ground beside him. He looked like he'd just woken up from a nap, his posture loose, sleepy. But when his eyes landed on us, and more specifically, on the rifle, his entire face changed. He tensed, just slightly, just enough for me to feel the shift. His eyes narrowed, and I suddenly realized how I must have looked. A stranger in camouflage, a weapon over my shoulder, walking in from the woods like something out of a training film. I raised a hand to wave, trying to smile, trying to show we weren't a threat. He gave a tight smile back, the kind you give someone you want to be far away from. Then he turned and walked off, his dog trotting ahead. I didn't move for a moment. Neither did Tom. It wasn't the kind of encounter that makes you panic, but it did make your heart beat faster, your palms sweat, your mind churn with possibilities. He'd seen us, and he'd definitely seen the gun. We hiked back to camp in silence. The lake looked darker than before, like the sky had stained the water. We boiled some water for tea and sat on rocks, saying nothing. I kept thinking about that man's eyes. The way he hadn't said a word, hadn't asked why we were there. It was like he already knew and just didn't like it. I propped the rifle against a rock and tried to forget about it. That afternoon we busied ourselves splitting wood, rearranging the tarp to keep rain out, adding more stones to the fire ring. As night fell again, we huddled near the flames and passed a beer around, sharing stories to keep the dread at bay. We joked about ghosts and soldiers, about cursed lakes and forest monsters. But the air didn't join in our laughter. It stayed still, the flames casting shadows across the tarp's edge like fingers twitching in the dark. I woke up to lights. Thin, straight beams of white slicing through the tarp, piercing the gloom. At first, I thought it was a dream, the kind that bleeds in from reality. But then I heard voices, loud, commanding, shouting, the kind of voices that give orders. Then a word landed like a hammer. Armed police. My body locked. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Then I moved, scrambling out of my sleeping bag, the cold biting into my hands. I heard Tom mutter something, Laura shifting beside me. We crawled toward the flap and opened it to a wall of blinding white. Flashlights, 5 or 6 of them. They were mounted on the ends of rifles, long black barrels pointed at our chests. I raised my hands. The order came fast. Face down, hands behind your head. I obeyed, my cheek pressing into wet ground, the smell of damp leaves and sweat filling my nose. Boots thudded around us. They moved fast, organized. Their voices clipped. I heard them rustling through our things. One shouted that they'd found the rifle. Another asked if we were part of some military group pathfinders, he said. I barely choked out a no. So did Tom and Laura. We weren't soldiers. We weren't anything. Just idiots trying to raise money. Eventually, the tension eased, slightly. Their lights lowered a bit. The guns didn't disappear, but the shouts stopped. They huddled a few meters away, muttering among themselves. I caught fragments. Report, civilian sighting, group with rifle. And then it hit me. The man with the dog. He'd seen us. And he'd called it in. They let us stand eventually. We explained everything, who we were, what we were doing, the charity, the hike. It sounded ridiculous even to my own ears, like something 3 amateurs would cook up to explain away a disaster. But somehow, they bought it. Or at least, they didn't push further. They took the rifle though, said it was a problem. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask when we'd get it back. They didn't mention our beer, though I saw one of them glance at the cans. Maybe they had bigger problems to worry about. Or maybe we'd just gotten lucky. When they left, the forest felt colder, quieter, like it had been holding its breath and was now waiting for something worse. We didn't sleep again that night. Just sat around the fire, staring into the flames like they might tell us what to do next. No one spoke. The gun was gone. The trust we had in the trip gone. All that was left was tension and silence and the crackle of burning wood. We stayed the full 7 days. I don't know why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe we were just too stubborn to back out. But the peaks never felt safe after that. Every time I saw movement in the trees, I tensed. Every sound became a threat. When we finally hiked out, I drove to the local police station. I expected questions, maybe even a fine. Instead, they just handed the rifle back like nothing had happened. No paperwork, no lecture. I walked out holding it like it was cursed. I haven't touched it since. The gray peaks are still there. The trails haven't changed. But I won't be back. That trip raised money, sure, but it left something else behind, a kind of fear that never really left me. Sometimes, in the quiet, I see those lights again. I feel the dirt on my face. I hear the voices, sharp and cold. And I wonder what would have happened if we'd moved the wrong way. If one of them had packed. If that rifle had looked a little too real. The peaks didn't scare me because of ghosts or monsters. They scared me because the real world followed us there, dressed in uniforms and holding guns. And in that place, there were no walls to hide behind. Just trees that watched and wind that carried your name into places you were never meant to be. In the summer of 2013, I felt like my life had shrunk to a tight, suffocating loop. I was stuck in Cleveland, Ohio, buried under debt and dragging myself through long, empty shifts at a call center, repeating the same phrases to strangers who didn't care if I lived or died. My sleep was shallow, my thoughts heavy, and every day bled into the next with no clear line between work and nothingness. When Tara, a friend I hadn't seen in a while, called out of nowhere and offered a weekend getaway, I didn't even hesitate. She said her family had a cabin near Lake Huron, out in a part of Michigan called Silver Pines. It was an old place, no Wi-Fi, no TV, no signal at all. Just woods, water, and quiet. She promised a few days of beer by the fire, fishing, and unplugging. Marcus, a mutual friend, was coming too. The idea felt like salvation. I packed a duffel bag, fueled up my aging hatchback, and drove north on the 5th of July. The highway slicing through flat farmland and past ghostly, half-abandoned towns. The farther I got, the more I breathed. The drive took about 6 hours. The sun hot against the windshield, sweat soaking into the small of my back. Silver Pines turned out to be smaller than I imagined. Barely a gas station and a boarded-up diner. Some mailboxes at the edge of the road that pointed toward winding gravel paths. Tara's family cabin was tucked about a mile from the lake, nestled between rows of tall, aging pines that whispered in the wind. The place had character, a sagging porch, peeling paint, the faint smell of damp wood and mildew, but it felt real. It felt forgotten in the best way. When I arrived, Marcus was already there, unloading a cooler filled with beer and bait. He gave me a grin and a hug, the kind of gesture that reminded me we hadn't seen each other in months, but hadn't really drifted apart. Tara came out next, keys in hand, wearing a crook smile and looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. She gave us the tour. Creaky floors, mismatched furniture, a kitchen with cupboards full of expired tea, and an upstairs that groaned with every step. It didn't matter. It was perfect. That night, we sat on the porch drinking beer, the air thick with humidity and the soft buzz of insects. Through the trees, we could just make out the shimmer of Lake Huron in the distance, a dark sheet of glass under the rising moon. Tara told us stories about the area, about logging trails long overgrown, forgotten campsites deep in the woods, and shacks that had been abandoned decades ago. One in particular caught my attention. She said there was a small pond a mile or so into the woods, and near it, a shack her uncle had shown her when she was a kid. No one used it anymore, and no one really talked about it. Something about it always stuck with her, though. Marcus cracked a joke about hillbillies and ghosts, and we all laughed. But even through the alcohol, I felt a chill creep into my spine. It was something in her voice, not dramatic, not spooky, just ... careful. That kind of careful that means you've remembered something more than once and never liked the way it made you feel. The next morning, we hiked to Lake Huron, following a narrow trail that curved between the trees and spilled out onto rocky shoreline. The lake stretched endlessly, glittering in the sun, the kind of blue that hurts your eyes if you stare too long. We tried fishing, but nothing bit, and eventually we gave up and just waded into the water like kids, laughing and splashing, the city slowly bleeding out of us. When we got back to the cabin, Tara brought up the trail to the pond again. She still remembered the way, she said. It wasn't far. Maybe an hour's walk, a little overgrown, but worth it. Marcus jumped at the idea, still in that explorer mood, and I went along, curiosity tugging harder than hesitation. We filled bottles with water, tossed a few snacks into my pack, and set off. The trail was thin and winding, swallowed in places by tall grasses and creeping vines. Pines arched overhead, their branches heavy and close, letting only slices of sunlight through. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet where even your breath sounds wrong. Tara led with confidence, though she hadn't been there in years. The ground grew soft underfoot, moss and pine needles muffling our steps. Occasionally, we'd hear the snap of a twig behind us and all freeze for half a second. But it was always nothing, or so we told ourselves. After maybe 40 minutes, we reached the pond. It was smaller than I expected, almost perfectly round, ringed with reeds and dark trees. The water was still, too still, like it hadn't moved in years. And there, on the far side, slumped against the trees like it had grown out of the dirt, was the shack. It looked worse than I imagined, part tin, part splintered wood, its roof sagging in the middle, like it was sinking into the earth. The windows were just empty holes, rimmed in shadow, and the door was cracked open, slightly ajar, as if it had been left that way on purpose. The place didn't just look abandoned, it looked like it had been forgotten on purpose. The trees leaned in too close around it, like they were trying to smother it or protect it. The air was thick, heavy with a smell I couldn't place, like wet fur and old rust. We walked around the edge of the pond, our feet sinking slightly into soft ground, until we reached the shack. Marcus peered through a gap in the wall first, then motioned for me. The inside was dark, and what little light filtered through the holes only made the shadows worse. The interior was empty, except for a broken chair and a few rusted cans. But what really got me were the walls. They were scratched, gouged deep, like something had clawed at them, again and again. At first I thought it was graffiti, but the patterns were too strange. Circles and lines, layered on top of each other, some burned into the wood like brands. It felt intentional, like someone had tried to leave a message, or a warning, or maybe a ritual. I stepped back, my chest tight. That smell was stronger now, sharp and coppery. Something else was in there, or had been recently. I told Tara we should go. She nodded slowly, her eyes wide, and Marcus was already turning away. We didn't speak. We just moved. Halfway around the pond, the silence broke. A hum began to rise, low and steady, not mechanical, but alive. It vibrated in my chest, as if the sound was coming from inside me. The surface of the pond trembled, though there was no wind. The water rippled outward in perfect circles, and then the door of the shack opened wider. Not from a breeze. From something inside, a shape moved. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. It didn't step out, but its outline crossed the threshold long limbs. Impossibly thin, a body that moved like it didn't have bones. The shape didn't belong in daylight, didn't belong anywhere. I felt the breath leave my lungs. Marcus froze, holding a stick like it could do anything. Tara grabbed my arm. The hum grew louder, and the shadow stretched, reaching for the water. And then it stopped. The hum ceased like a switch had been thrown. The pond stilled. The door stayed open. The shadow didn't return, but it also didn't leave. It just lingered, a smear of wrongness. We ran. There was no discussion, no final look back. We sprinted, crashing through the undergrowth, scraping our arms on branches, stumbling over roots. The trail felt longer, the woods darker, and the air heavier. When we reached the cabin, we locked the door for the first time all weekend. None of us said a word for nearly an hour. Marcus sat on the floor gripping the stick like it was still coming. Tara paced. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the woods through the window, half expecting to see something moving between the trees. We left the next morning, the 6th of July. No one wanted to talk about it. We threw our gear into the car without folding or checking anything, and the road out of Silver Pines felt colder than it had when we arrived. As we passed the lake, it looked beautiful again, calm, sparkling, completely unaware of what we'd seen. Back in Cleveland, I tried to sleep it off, drink it away, laugh about it, but the shack stayed with me. I started looking into the area. I found nothing, no records of the shack, no missing persons, no urban legends that matched. It was like it didn't exist. Like the forest wanted it that way. Tara and Marcus avoid the topic. I've stopped asking. I haven't gone camping since. I don't even walk near lakes if I can help it. The city is loud and dirty, but it's real. Whatever's out there, in that shack, near that pond, it doesn't want to be found. And I don't want to find it again. In the summer of 2017, I felt like I was disappearing into my own life. My apartment in Richmond, Virginia, had become a prison filled with flickering screens and echoing silence. I was stuck in a job I didn't care about, stuck in a loop of going out to bars and coming home emptier than when I left, stuck in a relationship that had frayed into long silencers and circular fights. I needed out away from everyone, from everything familiar, from the static of modern life. That's how I ended up packing a heavy rucksack and driving my pickup truck into the Blue Ridge Mountains for a solo backpacking trip. I'd been through parts of the Appalachians before, but I wanted to go deeper this time, 3 full days alone. No distractions, just me, the trail, and my thoughts. It was supposed to be healing. That's what I told myself. I brought all the usual gear: tent, stove, first aid, food for 4 days in case I stayed longer, a flashlight, and a knife that looked more impressive than it actually was. When I reached the trailhead, the sky was low and gray, the kind of sky that promises thunderstorms even when it's quiet. But the air was warm, heavy with pine and moss, and I felt good, like I could finally breathe. The first day was rough but manageable. I pushed through 10 miles of steep inclines and switchbacks, each step loosening the city's grip on my body. The path wound past old boulders and dense clusters of trees that muffled every sound. By the time dusk arrived, I found a decent clearing not far from a rocky outcrop, with soft ground thick with fallen needles. I set up my tent, made a quick meal of beans and dry crackers, and lay back to stare at the sky through the trees. The bugs hummed, the stars blinked into view, and I fell asleep fast, cocooned in the kind of silence you only find when the world forgets about you. The second day started well. I woke up early, my muscles stiff but ready, the air cooler and sharper. I packed quickly, tightened my boots, and kept moving. According to my map, I'd come to a river crossing soon not dangerous, just wide and slow moving. I wasn't worried, but when I reached it around midday, the river looked different than I expected. The water was calm, yes, but the rocks were slick with green moss, and the current tugged at my legs with surprising strength. Halfway across, I slipped. My boots skidded out from under me, and I fell, crashing into the water, my pack pulling me sideways. My ankle twisted sharply, a flash of pain so bright I nearly blacked out. I clawed my way to the far bank, dragging my soaked bag behind me, gasping with shock. Everything hurt. My ankle was already swelling, and my clothes clung to me with the weight of 1,000 pounds. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath, waiting for the nausea to pass. The damage wasn't catastrophic. I could still stand, but barely. My ankle throbbed with each step, and I knew I wouldn't make it to my next intended campsite near a waterfall. That's when I remembered seeing a cave marked on a map, a short detour north of where I was now. I'd circled it days ago as a curiosity, and now it looked like my only real option. I wasn't thrilled about it. Caves weren't exactly welcoming, but I needed shelter, and I needed it fast. I limped through undergrowth, following no real trail, using my walking stick as a crude crutch. The air grew heavier the deeper I went. The forest here was different. Quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, as if even the animals were avoiding it. I found the cave around 4 in the afternoon. Its mouth was a jagged black tear in the hillside, framed by vines that looked too still, like they weren't affected by the same wind that rustled the trees. I stepped inside carefully. The temperature dropped instantly, the cool air against my skin a strange relief. The floor was mostly dirt, scattered with rocks. I didn't go deep, just far enough to be shielded from the wind, and, if it rained, the water. I dropped my bag with a grunt, sat down, and examined my ankle. The swelling had worsened. I wrapped it tight with a spare t-shirt and elevated it on my pack. Pain radiated up my leg in slow, pulsing waves. I ate cold food that I barely tasted and tried to rest, but the cave shadows pressed in around me. I turned on my flashlight briefly and swept it around. The beam caught rough stone and nothing else. I told myself I was safe, that no one knew or cared where I was, and that was the point. Still, I slept poorly. My dreams were strange jumbled flashes of twisting trees and something breathing just outside the tent flap, though I hadn't brought a tent. At some point in the night, I woke with a start. My ankle burned, my body soaked in cold sweat. The cave was dark, pitch black, not even the faint light from the outside visible anymore. The air felt ... thicker. Still, I thought I was just having a panic attack until I heard something. A sound from deep within the cave, a soft movement, a scuffing noise, like something shifting across the dirt. I sat up quickly, gasping. The noise stopped. I froze, listening. For a long time, there was only silence. But then another faint shuffle, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight with fumbling hands and flicked it on. The light hit nothing but stone. No movement, no intruders. But I knew I hadn't imagined the sound. I turned the beam toward the back of the cave again, but it couldn't reach far. The darkness beyond that beam wasn't empty. It felt full, pressed, like it was watching me. Then, a flash, brief and unmistakable. A light, like a small flame or match, flared in the depths of the cave and vanished. My breath caught. It had been steady, like someone lighting a lantern, too consistent to be an illusion. I aimed my flashlight again, this time shaking. Nothing, but the fear settled into my bones now, heavy and deep. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I turned off the flashlight and sat there in the dark, knife in hand, too scared to shine a light that might tell something exactly where I was. Time crawled. I don't know how long I stayed that way, but at some point, the sound stopped. Or maybe I couldn't hear them anymore over the roar of my heartbeat. I didn't sleep. I just sat with my back against the wall, staring into the dark, waiting. When dawn finally bled into the entrance, I felt like I'd survived something without knowing exactly what it was. I stood, my ankle flaring up instantly, but I didn't care. I repacked as fast as I could, every sound behind me a potential threat. The cave now looked so normal in the light, just rocks, dust, nothing remarkable. But it had felt alive at night. And worse than that, it had felt occupied. I limped out, dragging my leg, pushing through branches and brush, keeping to open spaces, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I knew it hadn't been a dream. When I reached a ranger station several miles later, I told the man there that I'd hurt my ankle. Nothing more. He offered to call someone, but I waved him off. I just needed to get home. The drive back to Richmond was a blur, my hands gripping the wheel too tight, my eyes flicking between the mirrors and the road. Since then, I haven't been back to the Blue Ridge. I haven't hiked alone again, not in places where the trees grow too thick and the sky disappears. My ankle eventually healed, but something in me didn't. Sometimes I still dream of that flicker of light deep in the cave. That moment when I knew without proof that I wasn't alone. That someone or something had been there, watching, waiting, and not making a sound unless it wanted to. I still wonder if I would have seen more if I had stayed, if I had dared to move deeper. But I know I didn't want to. I escaped that place. Barely. Whatever lives in that cave lives in silence. And if I'd gone further, I might have stayed there forever. Just another flicker swallowed by the dark. It was the autumn of 2018, and my life in Burlington, Vermont, had finally worn me down to the bone. Between long shifts at the warehouse, a recent breakup that left me hollow, and the weight of unpaid bills stacking up on my kitchen counter, I felt like I was barely holding it together. My buddy Nate, who'd been watching me spiral for weeks, finally convinced me to take a break from everything. He knew a place, Cedar Lake, a remote spot tucked into the Green Mountains, somewhere he used to hike when he was a kid. He said it was quiet, untouched, and perfect for disappearing for a few days. Ellie joined us too, another friend whose passion for the outdoors made her a natural fit. The plan was simple. Camp for 3 nights, fish, drink, clear our heads. I needed the silence more than I realized. So that Friday morning, we loaded up my hatchback with gear tents, rods, coolers filled with beer and hot dogs, and headed toward the mountains. The trees lining the roads were ablaze in red and orange, branches clawing toward the sky. The kind of autumn that looks beautiful, but carries a strange sense of finality. When we finally reached Cedar Lake around midday, it looked like something out of a postcard, glass-like water reflecting the hills, not a ripple in sight. The campground was nearly empty, just a scattering of sites near the shore and a loop trail winding back into the trees. The season was ending, and it felt like we were the last people out there. That emptiness comforted me at first. We picked a spot near the lake's edge, tucked just enough into the woods to feel hidden, and quickly set up camp. The air was cool, and the silence around us was the kind that settled in your bones. That afternoon, we fished lazily from the shore, the water perfectly still beneath us. Nate caught a small trout, silver and flailing, but none of us really cared whether we caught anything or not. It was enough just to be there, to breathe air that didn't smell like oil and exhaust. That evening, we built a fire and passed beers around, talking about nothing and everything. Ellie brought up a story she'd found online about the lake, a legend from the logging era, about workers who'd gone missing one by one, their tools left untouched, their camps abandoned. The company shut down the whole operation afterward, or so the story went. I brushed it off as old folklore, the kind of thing bored hikers made up. But even as I laughed, I caught myself glancing toward the tree line, where the dark had already crept in and swallowed everything beyond the fire's reach. The next day was colder. We decided to hike the loop trail Nate had mentioned, a narrow path that curled through the forest and rose up a low ridge. The pines pressed in close, the canopy so dense in places that the sunlight barely filtered through. It felt like stepping into a different world, one that had never heard of cars or phones or jobs. We hiked for a few hours, stopping at the top of the ridge to drink water and look down at the lake below. From up there, it seemed too still. No ripples, no birds, just glass. We ate in silence. As we packed up to head back down, I caught a strange smell on the air, sharp, sour, something faintly rotten. I glanced at Nate and Ellie, and both of them had wrinkled their noses too. It wasn't strong, but it lingered as we made our way down, threading through the pines like smoke. We didn't talk much after that. The silence had grown heavier, more watchful. Something about it felt off. When we got back to camp, the lake looked different again. A mist had crept in, low and slow, curling across the surface and creeping toward the trees. It hadn't been there that morning. We tried fishing again, but nothing bit. The water had gone still in a way that didn't feel natural, and the line just hung limp in the water. Eventually, we gave up and lit the fire again, building it higher this time. We were trying to shake off a tension none of us wanted to admit to. That night, I drank more than I should have. I remember the fire, the flicker of orange on Ellie's face, and Nate talking about a dream he'd had the night before, something about drowning. I laughed it off and cracked another beer, but his voice was flat, like it wasn't a joke. By the time we crawled into our tents, the fog had thickened into a blanket, wrapping around the camp like a warning. I woke up sometime after midnight. My bladder screamed for attention, and the cold outside my sleeping bag made the decision harder. Eventually, I unzipped the tent and stepped into the dark. The fire had burned down to a few glowing coals, and the mist was thicker than before, swirling in slow waves across the lake. I walked a few yards toward a tree and relieved myself, my breath steaming in the air. That's when I saw it. Across the lake, standing perfectly still near the opposite shore, was a figure. Tall, thin, motionless. The fog wrapped around it like it belonged there, but I could see enough. There was no light, no sound. Just that shape. I froze. I didn't call out. I didn't even breathe. Then, slowly, the figure raised one arm and pointed not at me, but at the water. Its gesture was precise, almost ritualistic, like it was marking something, claiming something. My mouth went dry. I backed up step by step, never taking my eyes off it. But the fog thickened again, and within seconds, it was gone. The shore was empty, the water untouched. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my tent with my knife in hand, listening to the wind, or what I thought was wind brushing through the trees. At dawn, I told Nate and Ellie what I'd seen. I expected them to mock me, maybe accuse me of dreaming, but they didn't. Ellie looked pale, her hands clenched in her lap. Nate said he'd felt watched the day before, especially on the ridge. He hadn't wanted to say anything. We didn't eat breakfast. We just started packing. As we loaded the car, I went to gather our fishing rods from the shore where we'd left them the night before. But they were gone. Not broken or scattered, just gone. Like someone had walked off with them during the night. The soft earth near the lake was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks. The fog clung to the ground like smoke. I didn't say anything. I just turned and walked back to the car. The trees loomed behind us, the lake silent and still. The drive back was quiet. None of us wanted to be the first to bring it up. Back in Burlington, I tried to search for answers. Any mention of disappearances near Cedar Lake, any old folklore that might explain what I saw. But nothing came up. Ellie's old story about the vanished loggers was the only thing remotely close, and even that was more rumor than record. Nate and I hung out once or twice after, but it wasn't the same. That trip had left something behind, a weight we didn't want to touch. I haven't been back to Cedar Lake. I haven't been camping since. There's something about that place, something old and quiet and patient. Whatever I saw that night wasn't a dream. It wasn't a ghost story or a trick of the fog. It was a warning, one that I'm still trying to understand. And part of me hopes I never do. In the fall of 2016, everything in my life felt tight and repetitive, like I was caught in a loop I couldn't break. I was living in Albany, New York, working a dull office job that blurred into itself day after day, and spending my evenings in a shared apartment where even arguments about dishes had become part of the routine. I needed a change, even if it was just temporary. That's when my cousin Ryan invited me out to Willow Grove, a small town tucked into the base of the Adirondacks where he'd recently moved. He'd found a cheap little cabin just outside of town and kept telling me how amazing the woods were, untouched and filled with trails that no one used anymore. It sounded peaceful, exactly the kind of quiet I craved. So I took a long weekend, threw a few things in a bag, and drove up. I remember how the colors changed as I left the city behind yellows. Oranges, reds painting the hills, the air crisp enough to roll down the windows and breathe. Ryan's cabin sat near the edge of the forest, a cozy 2-bedroom place with a porch that faced nothing but trees. There was something comforting about how isolated it was. He welcomed me with his usual grin and handed me a beer before I'd even taken my jacket off. He already had a plan said we'd hike into the woods, pitch a tent near a stream he'd found, and stay out overnight. Nothing fancy. Just 2 cousins catching up by a fire under the stars. We left that evening, packs slung over our shoulders. Ryan leading the way with a machete for clearing brush, and me carrying an old hunting knife I barely remembered how to use. The trail started easy, a worn dirt path through pines that smelled like cold air or memory. The sun was already sinking, stretching shadows long across the forest floor. Ryan pointed out landmarks as we went, rocks shaped like skulls, trees twisted unnaturally, like the woods were quietly writhing. We hiked a few miles, the path slowly vanishing beneath fallen leaves and moss, until we reached the stream. It was shallow and clear, the water bubbling softly over smooth stones, and the area around it was flat enough for our tent. We set up camp as the last of the light faded, then built a small fire and sat back with more beer and some food we'd packed. Ryan started telling local stories he'd picked up in town, most of them silly, about haunted barns and phantom trains. But one story stuck with me. He said there was an old legend about a farmer who went mad back in the early 1900s. Supposedly, he murdered his entire family with an axe and then disappeared into the woods. Some claimed he was still out there, headless, wandering the trees, killing anyone he found trespassing. Ryan laughed as he told it, probably trying to spook me, but the way the shadows flickered behind him made it harder to shake off than I wanted to admit. I fell asleep with that story still echoing in my head. The night was cold, and the stream murmured quietly outside the tent. I must have slept for a few hours before something woke me up, an urgent pressure in my bladder and a strange stillness outside. The forest was too quiet, like it had pressed pause on every living thing. I unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to wake Ryan, and stepped into the chill. My breath clouded in the air. I walked a few feet to a tree, did what I needed to do, then looked around. That's when I saw it. Off in the distance, through the trees, there was a light. Not moonlight or firelight, something flickering, orange and steady, like a lantern. It hovered behind the trees, not moving, not swaying, just glowing. I stood there, frozen. I should have gone back to the tent, should have pretended I hadn't seen it. But something pulled at me. The same curiosity that makes people open doors they know they shouldn't. I moved slowly, one step at a time, weaving between the trees until I found the edge of a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. And that's where I saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the clearing, tall and still and broad-shouldered. The lantern wasn't a lantern. It was light coming from the thing's hands, or what should have been hands. A glow, soft but unnatural, pulsing slightly like a heartbeat. And the figure god, it didn't have a head. Its neck ended in a ragged stump, raw and glistening, as if it had just happened. The light from its hands lit up the trees, cast long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught between disbelief and a terror so pure it made my body forget how to function. The thing didn't move. It didn't need to. I could feel it seeing me, even without eyes. My skin prickled like it was being touched by something invisible. Then it lifted its arms slowly, and the light flared brighter, flickering violently. I stumbled backward. I didn't scream, I couldn't. I turned and ran, branches whipping my face, roots catching my boots, the forest spinning around me. Somehow, I found the campsite again. Ryan was sitting upright, holding his machete, already pale. He must have heard something, felt something. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. He saw my face and understood immediately. We didn't talk. We just tore down the tent with shaking hands, stuffed what we could into our bags, and left everything else behind. The stream no longer made a sound. The forest felt like it was breathing around us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting that light, that figure, to come sliding through the trees. It never did. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. We hiked out in silence, our flashlights barely strong enough to pierce the dark. The trail seemed longer on the way back, like the forest had shifted around us, dragging out the path to keep us inside. My legs screamed with every step. My heart pounded like it was trying to tear itself out of my chest. When we finally saw Ryan's cabin through the trees, it felt like breaking through to another world. We didn't speak until we were inside, doors locked, every curtain drawn. I told him what I'd seen, every detail, and he listened without interrupting, the color draining from his face. He hadn't seen it, but he said he'd felt it, like the trees had changed, like something had turned and looked at him through the dark. We didn't report anything. What would we even say? That we saw a headless man glowing in the woods? That the air itself had changed? Ryan moved out of Willow Grove a few months later. Said he couldn't sleep there anymore. I tried to look up the story, checked local records, newspapers, even obscure forms. Nothing. No murders, no missing persons, no historical records of a killer farmer. It was like the forest had swallowed the truth. Or maybe it had never let it escape. I haven't been back to the Adirondacks. I avoid deep woods now, especially in autumn, especially near streams. Cities feel safer, even when they're not. At least in the city, you know where the danger hides. Out there in Willow Grove, I learned that some things don't care about being seen, don't bother hiding. They wait in the woods, headless and glowing, and sometimes they point at you like they remember your name. It was the dead of winter in 2015 when I finally reached my limit. Life in Syracuse, New York, felt like a gray box slowly closing in. I worked long shifts behind the counter at a coffee shop where people barely made eye contact, trudged home, through piles of snow to a cold, empty apartment, and sat in silence most nights haunted more by boredom than loneliness. Then out of nowhere, my old friend Caleb called. I hadn't heard from him in over a year, but he sounded energized, different. He'd just bought a small fixer-upper cabin in a quiet town near the Canadian border called Ash Creek. It was a town no one ever talked about, barely a dot on the map. Caleb told me I needed to get away, and he was right. He promised beers by a wood stove, fresh air, and no pressure to talk about anything serious. I packed a bag, threw it into the back of my rusty sedan, and hit the road on the evening of the 10th of February, leaving Syracuse in a swirl of exhaust and snow. The drive was long and lonely, winding through frozen farmland and past dark, sleeping villages. The snow fell steadily, brushing against the windshield in endless waves, and as I got closer to Ash Creek, the trees thickened on either side of the road, tall and skeletal, like a forest of bones. The highway thinned to a narrow lane, barely wide enough for 2 cars, flanked by ditches and walls of snow. I slowed down, knowing I was close, watching the GPS count down the miles. That's when it happened. Around one of the final bends, something darted across the road. It was fast and large, too upright to be a deer, and too slender to be a bear. I didn't see it clearly, just a blur of limbs and darkness, but the way it moved made my stomach twist. It didn't gallop or run, it glided. My hands jerked the wheel. The car swerved violently, and I slammed the brakes just in time to avoid sliding into a snow-filled ditch. The vehicle stopped at an angle, the tires whining. I sat there for a long second, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart racing, staring into the space where it had vanished. Nothing. No tracks. No sound. Just the falling snow and the faint hum of the engine. I convinced myself it was a deer, maybe one injured or dragging a leg, but that thought didn't sit right. Still, I kept driving. Caleb's cabin appeared not long after, buried in snow, just one light glowing from a window like it was waiting for me. He came out bundled in a thick jacket, beard longer than I remembered, smiling like everything was fine. He handed me a beer before I was even through the door, and I tried to shake off the unease. The cabin was small but warm, the wood stove blazing, and the smell of pine and ash immediately made me feel safer. We caught up for hours, laughing about old memories, talking about music and women, and the messes we'd made of our 20s. But I didn't tell him about what I'd seen on the road. Not yet. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Caleb wanted to explore the woods behind the cabin, said there were miles of trails and a creek that had frozen over beautifully. We bundled up, layered in jackets and scarves, and set out with thermoses of hot coffee and thick boots crunching through snowdrifts. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that echoes, the only sound our breathing and the occasional creak of a tree branch under the weight of ice. Caleb led the way confidently, pointing out old landmarks he'd discovered. A rusted sled half buried near a stump, a crumbling fence post, and the skeletal remains of what may have been a deer, picked clean by time or predators. The deeper we walked, the more I felt that uneasy feeling return, the same sensation from the road, like the woods were watching. I tried to ignore it, but it stuck, whispering at the edge of every sound. We reached the creek around noon, frozen solid and slick, a ribbon of silver cutting through the trees. Caleb joked about building a little skating rink there someday, and I laughed along, even though my eyes kept drifting to the shadows between the pines. That afternoon, clouds rolled back in, thick and heavy. We turned back, trudging through snow that had started to fall again. I was sweating under my jacket, not from exertion, but from the gnawing awareness that something wasn't right. The trees felt closer. The silence felt intentional. Caleb noticed I was spooked, but didn't say anything. That night, we drank again, sitting close to the stove while snow piled high against the windows. Caleb finally opened up about Ash Creek. He said it was weird. The people were quiet, polite, but distant. The kind of town where everyone seemed to know something but wouldn't say it. He joked that the woods had a way of playing tricks on people. I told him what I saw on the road, the shape that moved wrong, too fast and too tall. He didn't laugh, didn't call me crazy. He just stared at the fire, then changed the subject. That should have told me everything. We were supposed to drive into town the next day for supplies, just to stretch our legs and pick up more beer and food. When we woke up on the 11th of February, the snow had let up, but left behind high drifts and narrow paths barely wide enough for tires. I started the car early to warm it up and began brushing snow off the hood. That's when I saw it. I froze. There, stretched across the middle of the hood like some horrific offering, was a sheet of skin, not a hide or pelt. A skin, raw, wet, torn along the edges like it had been peeled off in a single motion. It was large, possibly from a deer, but it didn't look like any hunting scrap I'd ever seen. The veins ran through it like a living map, and the color was a sickly blend of pink, red, and gray. There was no blood trail, no prints in the snow. Just the skin, perfectly draped across the metal as though placed there with care. I backed away, heart pounding, bile rising in my throat. Caleb came out seconds later, still pulling on his jacket, and stopped dead when he saw it. Neither of us spoke. We just stared. The air around us was dead still. Even the birds had gone quiet. I grabbed a stick and used it to lift the thing off the hood, dumping it into the snowbank. It hit with a soft, wet sound that I'll never forget. We didn't go to town. We didn't even leave the porch after that. Caleb bolted the door for the first time since I arrived, and we spent the rest of the day inside, the sound of the wind replaced by a crushing silence between us. I asked him again what he knew about the woods. He just shook his head. He said he'd heard stories, but nothing concrete. Sometimes hunters went too deep and didn't come back. Sometimes dogs disappeared. Sometimes you'd hear something outside at night, walking on the roof, dragging through the snow, breathing too close to the window. But nothing ever showed up. Not until now. I left that afternoon, heart racing the whole drive back. Every time I glanced at the hood of the car, I expected to see something there again. Fresh, new, twitching. But there was nothing. Just cold metal and melting snow. Back in Syracuse, I tried to forget. I told myself it was a prank, a hunter's twisted idea of a joke. But it never sat right. I called Caleb once more, asked if anything else had happened. He said no, but he sounded different, distant, like he was trying not to remember. He sold the cabin the next spring and moved down south. We haven't spoken since. I've never gone back to Ash Creek. I stay off back roads now, especially in winter, especially near woods that stretch too far without interruption. I've read about places like that, pockets of land that don't follow the same rules. Places where old things still linger, feeding on silence, watching. I still think about the skin, how cleanly it had been peeled, how deliberately it had been placed. I don't think it was a warning. I think it was a message. Something was watching us. Something that didn't want us there. And I don't plan on giving it a second chance to make its point. It was the spring of 2012, sometime in late April, when the restlessness inside me finally cracked open into something I couldn't ignore. Life in Rochester, New York, had become a flat routine: early mornings teaching high school history to kids who couldn't care less, late nights grading papers under flickering kitchen lights, and entire weekends that vanished in a fog of noise and obligation. I needed a break. Not a vacation with hotels and itineraries. I needed something raw. When my friend Sarah suggested a weekend hiking trip into the Catskills, I jumped at it. She'd heard about a trail near a place called Raven Hollow, deep in the woods, far off the usual routes. Supposedly, it passed an old abandoned church from the 1800s-something, left behind by loggers when the forest swallowed the town. The way she described it made it sound more like a myth than a real destination. But I didn't care. I just needed to get away. We packed light tents, food, water, a basic map, and left early on a Saturday morning, the 21st of April. The sun broke through thin clouds as we drove, warming the hills, casting shadows across the pines. The further we went, the more the road narrowed, until finally the trees pressed in on both sides and the world felt like it had forgotten itself. By noon, we'd reached a small pull-off near the trailhead. The air smelled like earth and fresh moss, sharp with the promise of rain, even though the sky was still bright. Sarah was buzzing with energy, practically bouncing out of the car as we strapped on our packs. We followed a trail that curved along a creek, its water clear and fast, weaving like a silver thread through the forest. The hiking was easy at first. The trail was narrow but well-worn, and we walked in comfortable silence, the sound of water and birdsong wrapping around us. 3 miles in, we found a flat clearing near the creek to set up camp. Moss covered the ground like carpet, and tall birches arched overhead, their branches catching golden light like netting. It felt like we'd stepped into a painting. We pitched our tents, built a small fire, and sat on logs eating sandwiches, our fingers sticky with peanut butter and sap. Sarah read from a guidebook she'd brought, the kind you find in small town bookstores, filled with legends and local history. That's when she told me about the church. Built in 1832 by loggers who tried to settle the valley. They abandoned it just 8 years later after several people disappeared and others claimed the forest turned. Services stopped and the building was left to rot. The guidebook claimed the church still stood somewhere beyond the old footbridge, hidden behind trees and stone. I raised an eyebrow but didn't say much. Ghost stories were part of the woods. You learn to accept them as background noise. But even then, something about the way she said, turned, stayed with me. We slept deeply that night, wrapped in layers, lulled by the creek's endless murmur. In the morning, the forest felt changed, not threatening, just stiller. The birds had quieted, and the light came through the trees in long pale shafts that didn't seem to warm anything. We decided to look for the church. Just a quick walk, we said. No rush, no pressure. We packed snacks, water, and Sarah marked our camp on a paper map before folding it into her jacket. The instructions were vague: cross a wooden bridge, find the forked oak, look for a boulder shaped like a fist. We followed the creek until we reached the bridge, old and warped, its planks gray and split. But it held. The forest changed after that. The trail narrowed and the trees thickened. The sun barely made it through the canopy. The air grew heavier, like walking through water. The forked oak stood crooked, just as the book described, and from there we turned north, bushwhacking through undergrowth, stepping over tangled roots and ducking beneath branches. Then we found the boulder, and past it, a path barely visible, more suggestion than trail. We followed it. I don't know when we first heard it, maybe 20 minutes in. A faint hum, low and even, like the vibration of something deep underground. It wasn't loud, just enough to make your chest feel tight. I thought maybe it was my imagination, but when I looked at Sarah, her brow was furrowed. She heard it too. We didn't talk much. We just kept walking. Then we saw it. A stone wall appeared through the trees, half collapsed and moss-covered, like the earth was trying to erase it. Beyond the wall, the forest opened into a clearing, and in the middle of that clearing stood the church. It looked wrong. Not just old or broken, but wrong, like it had grown out of the ground instead of being built. The steeple had collapsed long ago. The roof sagged in the middle, and its walls were wrapped in vines so thick they pulsed when the wind shifted. The windows were black holes, and the doorway hung open as if waiting. I felt it the moment I stepped closer, a pressure, not pain, just resistance, like the forest itself didn't want us near it. We stood at the threshold, staring in. The interior was shadowy and cold, even in the daylight. Pews lay splintered across the floor. The altar was intact but covered in grime, and above it hung a crooked wooden cross, its edges splintered. The walls were stained with streaks of soot or mold or something else. We didn't go inside. We didn't need to. The hum was louder now. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a presence, buzzing in the back of my teeth, settling behind my eyes. Then Sarah grabbed my arm. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Her voice didn't sound like her. It sounded younger, smaller. I turned and looked where she pointed. In the woods, just beyond the far side of the clearing, something moved. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but it wasn't. It stood too tall, too still, thin limbs. No face, just a shape, half shadow, half form, watching. I don't know how I knew it was looking at us, but I did. Every inch of me tensed. The church behind us felt like it was breathing. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, silent and awful, like it had always been part of the woods, and we'd finally caught it looking back. We left, slowly at first, then faster. We didn't run. We didn't want to, not in that place. But our steps were rushed, purposeful. The hum faded behind us as we passed the boulder, then the forked oak, then the bridge. The forest grew warmer again. The light returned. But something followed. Not footsteps. Just a pressure, like the forest had shifted slightly. and all the trees had leaned a little closer. We packed our things without speaking, our hands clumsy. The creek sounded louder now, rushing and frantic. When we finally got into the car and drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see anything standing on the trail. Back in Rochester, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to find records of the church searched through online archives, town records, old books. There was a mention of a logging chapel built in 1832 and a fire that burned half the congregation in 1840. But nothing since, no ruins, no confirmed location. Raven Hollow itself barely existed on any modern map. Sarah doesn't talk about it. She changes the subject whenever I bring it up. I stopped trying after a while, but I still hear that hum sometimes, when it's late, when the world is too quiet. And I still dream of that shape standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting.